The transformation of exotic drugs from mysterious Eastern curiosities into fashionable Parisian indulgences began with the clash of empires and the ambitions of one man whose reach would extend far beyond the battlefields of Europe. When Napoleon Bonaparte launched his Egyptian campaign in 1798, he envisioned more than military conquest. He sought to position France as the heir to ancient civilizations and the gateway between East and West. His expedition included not only seasoned generals and battle-hardened soldiers, but also a remarkable collection of scholars, scientists, and artists tasked with documenting and understanding every aspect of Egyptian culture. This intellectual army would prove as consequential as the military one, for they would return to France carrying knowledge that would fundamentally alter European consciousness. The French soldiers who marched across the Egyptian desert encountered a world where the boundaries between medicine, spirituality, and recreation were far more fluid than anything they had known in Europe. In the coffee houses of Cairo and Alexandria, they observed locals consuming hashish with the same casual familiarity that Parisians might drink wine. Egyptian physicians employed opium with sophisticated understanding of its properties, using it not merely as a crude painkiller, but as a precise instrument for treating everything from dysentery to melancholia. The French witnessed religious ceremonies where hashish facilitated mystical experiences and social gatherings where these substances enhanced conversation and contemplation in ways that seemed to unlock hidden dimensions of human interaction. Initially, many French soldiers approached these substances with the skepticism of outsiders encountering unfamiliar customs. However, the harsh realities of desert warfare, the constant pain of wounds, the psychological strain of being far from home, the need for any respite from the brutal conditions, gradually broke down their resistance. Soldiers began experimenting with local remedies, discovering that a small amount of opium could transform unbearable pain into manageable discomfort, while hashish could provide temporary escape from the monotony and terror of military life. What began as medical necessity evolved into cultural curiosity, as French troops found themselves drawn into the complex social rituals surrounding these substances. Napoleon himself grew increasingly alarmed by his army's fascination with hashish, recognizing that widespread drug use posed a serious threat to military discipline and effectiveness. His famous prohibition, issued in October 1800, declared that hashish caused soldiers to lose their reason and fall into violent delirium, making them unfit for combat. The ban reflected not just practical military concerns, but also deeper French anxieties about cultural contamination, the fear that exposure to Eastern practices might somehow corrupt the rational, disciplined character that the French believed defined their national identity. Yet prohibition proved largely ineffective, as soldiers had already discovered the profound appeal of substances that could temporarily transport them beyond the harsh realities of their circumstances. When the Egyptian expedition finally ended in failure and withdrawal, the returning soldiers carried more than memories of military defeat. They brought with them samples of hashish and opium, along with detailed knowledge of preparation methods, consumption rituals, and cultural contexts that had previously been unknown in Europe. These veterans became the first conduits in what would develop into a sophisticated network for importing and distributing exotic drugs throughout French society. Their first-hand accounts of Eastern drug culture, shared in taverns and salons across France, created a foundation of knowledge and curiosity that would prove crucial to the later widespread adoption of these substances. The French conquest of Algeria from 1830 to 1847 represented a far more systematic and sustained encounter with drug-using cultures than the brief Egyptian adventure had provided. Unlike the temporary military occupation of Egypt, the Algerian conquest involved the establishment of permanent colonial administration, extensive settlement by French civilians, and deep integration between French and North African societies. This prolonged contact created multiple pathways for the transmission of drug knowledge and substances from Algeria to metropolitan France, transforming what had been sporadic military encounters into regular commercial and cultural exchanges. French colonial administrators in Algeria found themselves governing populations for whom hashish and opium were deeply embedded in medical, religious, and social practices. Rather than simply prohibiting these substances, many administrators chose to study and regulate them, recognizing that understanding local drug culture was essential to effective governance. French military doctors began systematic investigations of how Algerian physicians used these substances, documenting their therapeutic applications and attempting to separate genuine medical benefits from what they perceived as mere superstition. These studies produced detailed reports that circulated among French medical professionals, gradually building scientific credibility for substances that had previously been dismissed as primitive intoxicants. The economic dimensions of colonial drug trade proved equally important in establishing regular supply chains between Algeria and France. French merchants quickly recognized the commercial potential of substances that commanded high prices among European consumers seeking exotic experiences. Hashish and opium could be purchased relatively cheaply in Algerian markets and transported to France with substantial profit margins, creating powerful economic incentives for the development of smuggling networks. These commercial operations often operated with the tacit approval or active participation of colonial officials who saw drug trade as one way to make the expensive colonial enterprise financially viable. French settlers in Algeria played a particularly crucial role in normalizing the use of these substances among European populations. Unlike military personnel or colonial administrators who maintained some psychological distance from local culture, settlers often adopted Algerian customs out of practical necessity and social integration. French families living in Algeria for extended periods found themselves participating in local social rituals that included hashish consumption, while French merchants and craftsmen working alongside Algerian colleagues gradually incorporated these substances into their daily routines. When these settlers returned to France for visits or permanent relocation, they brought with them not just substances, but also the cultural knowledge necessary for their proper use. The intellectual climate of early 19th century France proved remarkably receptive to these exotic imports. The Romantic movement had already challenged Enlightenment rationality, celebrating emotion, intuition, and the exploration of alternative ways of understanding reality. French intellectuals were fascinated by reports of substances that could artificially induce the very states of heightened perception and emotional intensity that Romantic artists had been striving to achieve through purely creative means. The Orient, as imagined by French thinkers, represented a realm where consciousness could be deliberately altered to achieve insights unavailable to the purely rational Western mind. By the 1840s, these various streams of colonial contact had converged to create unprecedented availability of and familiarity with exotic drugs in French society. The substances that had once been mysterious curiosities encountered by soldiers in distant lands had become accessible commodities that could be purchased in Parisian pharmacies or obtained through networks of returning colonists and adventurous merchants. The stage was set for the systematic experimentation that would characterize the next phase of French drug culture, as the intellectual elite began to explore these substances not as medical necessities or exotic curiosities, but as tools for expanding human consciousness and artistic creativity. In the quiet laboratory of a small German apothecary shop in Paderborn, a 20-year-old apprentice named Friedrich Wilhelm Adamserturner was about to achieve what alchemists had dreamed of for centuries, the isolation of a pure crystalline substance that would revolutionize both medicine and human consciousness. The year was 1805, And while Napoleon's armies marched across Europe, reshaping the political landscape, Sir Turner was engaged in a different kind of conquest, one that would prove equally transformative in its own domain. Working with primitive equipment and guided more by intuition than established scientific protocol, this young chemist was on the verge of birthing the modern pharmaceutical age through his methodical investigation of the opium poppy's mysterious properties. Sir Turner's breakthrough emerged from a combination of scientific curiosity and practical necessity that characterized the best research of his era. Opium had been used medicinally for thousands of years, but its effects remained frustratingly unpredictable. The same dose that provided blessed relief to one patient might prove dangerously toxic to another, while preparations that worked miracles in one batch might prove completely ineffective in the next. This inconsistency plagued physicians and apothecaries throughout Europe who recognized opium's tremendous therapeutic potential but struggled with its unreliable nature. The problem lay in the fact that raw opium contained dozens of different compounds in varying concentrations, making standardized dosing virtually impossible. The young apprentice approached this challenge with a methodical precision that would define his entire career. Rather than accepting opium's variability as an inherent characteristic, Sir Turner hypothesized that the poppy's effects must be caused by specific chemical compounds that could be isolated and purified. This was a radical concept in an age when most natural remedies were used in their crude, unprocessed forms, and when the very idea of isolating pure chemical compounds from plant materials was still largely theoretical. Working in the evenings after completing his regular duties at the apothecary, Sir Turner began a series of painstaking experiments designed to separate opium into its constituent parts. His methodology was elegantly simple yet revolutionary in its implications. Sir Turner dissolved raw opium in various acids and alkalis, carefully observing how different chemical treatments affected the mixture's properties. Through countless hours of trial and error, he discovered that treating opium with ammonia produced a white crystalline precipitate that possessed all of opium's pain-relieving properties, but in a far more concentrated and predictable form. These crystals were unlike anything previously isolated from plant materials. They were pure, stable, and possessed consistent effects that could be measured and standardized with unprecedented precision. The isolation process itself was a marvel of chemical ingenuity that demonstrated Sir Turner's intuitive understanding of molecular behavior decades before the atomic theory was fully developed. He found that by carefully controlling the pH of his solutions and manipulating temperature and concentration, he could coax these mysterious crystals to separate from the complex mixture of compounds that comprised raw opium. The crystals formed slowly, like frost gathering on a window, each one identical to the others in both appearance and potency. This reproducibility was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Sir Turner's discovery. For the first time in human history, a plant-derived medicine could be produced with pharmaceutical precision. The naming of his discovery revealed both Sir Turner's classical education and his poetic sensibility. He chose morphine in honor of Morpheus, the Greek god of sleep and dreams, recognizing that his crystalline compound possessed an almost supernatural ability to transport users into states of consciousness that bordered on the divine. Morpheus, son of Hypnos, the god of sleep, was said to appear in dreams bearing messages from the gods, shaping the visions that visited mortals during their most vulnerable hours. The parallel was unmistakable. Sir Turner's morphine could induce sleep so profound that it seemed to open doorways to otherworldly realms, while simultaneously providing relief from pain so complete that it felt like divine intervention. The choice of name also reflected the profound philosophical implications of Sir Turner's work. By isolating morphine, he had essentially captured and concentrated the essence of dreams themselves, creating a substance that could artificially induce the boundary states between waking and sleeping consciousness that had fascinated philosophers and mystics for millennia. The crystals represented more than mere chemical compounds. They were physical manifestations of humanity's eternal quest to transcend the limitations of ordinary consciousness and experience reality from perspectives unavailable to the unaltered mind. Sir Turner's initial experiments with his new compound revealed effects that were both more powerful and more predictable than anything achievable with raw opium. A tiny amount of pure morphine could provide pain relief equivalent to massive doses of crude opium, while producing fewer of the unpleasant side effects that often accompanied traditional preparations. The crystals dissolved readily in water, creating solutions that could be measured with mathematical precision and administered with confidence in their effects. This standardization represented a quantum leap forward in medical practice, offering physicians a tool of unprecedented reliability and potency. The young chemist's work also revealed morphine's darker potential with startling clarity. The same purity that made the compound so effective medicinally also made it far more addictive than raw opium. Users who experimented with morphine often found themselves drawn back to it with an intensity that surprised even experienced opium users. The concentrated nature of the compound seemed to create dependencies that developed more rapidly and proved more difficult to break than those associated with traditional opium preparations. Sir Turner himself became one of morphine's first documented addicts, a cautionary tale that would be repeated countless times as his discovery spread throughout the medical community. The broader implications of Sir Turner's breakthrough extended far beyond the realm of pain management. His successful isolation of morphine demonstrated that the active principles of medicinal plants could be identified, extracted, and purified using chemical techniques. This insight would inspire generations of researchers to investigate other plant medicines, leading to the discovery of quinine, cocaine, caffeine, and dozens of other alkaloids that would transform both medicine and society. The pharmaceutical industry, as we know it today, can trace its origins directly to that small German laboratory where a young apprentice first coaxed pure morphine crystals from the ancient opium poppy. By 1817, Sir Turner had refined his isolation techniques sufficiently to begin commercial production of morphine, making his discovery available to physicians throughout Europe. The impact was immediate and profound. Doctors finally possessed a pain reliever of known potency that could be administered with confidence and precision. Yet even as morphine began its transformation of medical practice, its potential for both healing and harm was becoming increasingly apparent, setting the stage for the complex relationship between society and pharmaceutical drugs that would define the coming century. In the salons and cafés of 19th century Paris, a profound intellectual hunger was stirring, a yearning that transcended mere academic curiosity and touched the very soul of French cultural identity. The French intelligentsia found themselves increasingly captivated by what they perceived as the mysterious otherness of the East, a realm that seemed to offer alternatives to the rigid rationalism and industrial mechanization that were rapidly transforming European society. This fascination was not merely exotic tourism of the mind, but rather a serious philosophical quest to understand different ways of being human, different modes of consciousness, and different relationships between the material and spiritual worlds. The Ottoman Empire and the broader Levant represented, in the French imagination, a civilization where ancient wisdom still flourished, where the boundaries between the sacred and profane remained fluid, and where substances like opium and hashish served as bridges between ordinary consciousness and transcendent experience. The roots of this intellectual obsession could be traced to the profound cultural dislocations that accompanied France's rapid modernization during the early 19th century. The Industrial Revolution had brought unprecedented material prosperity and technological advancement, but it had also created a sense of spiritual emptiness that many French thinkers found deeply troubling. The mechanistic worldview that dominated European science and philosophy seemed to reduce human existence to mere material processes, leaving little room for mystery, transcendence, or the exploration of consciousness itself. Against this backdrop, reports from French travelers, diplomats, and scholars who had encountered Eastern cultures painted tantalizing pictures of societies where different priorities prevailed, where contemplation was valued over productivity, where altered states of consciousness were cultivated rather than feared, and where ancient traditions offered pathways to wisdom that European rationalism had seemingly abandoned. French Orientalist scholarship, which flourished throughout the 19th century, played a crucial role in shaping these perceptions and creating intellectual frameworks for understanding Eastern drug culture. Scholars like Sylvestre de Sacy, who held the first chair of Arabic at the Collège de France, produced detailed studies of Islamic civilization that emphasized the sophisticated philosophical and scientific traditions of the Muslim world. These academic works, while often colored by colonial prejudices and romantic idealizations, nevertheless introduced French intellectuals to concepts of consciousness and spirituality that challenged European assumptions about the nature of human experience. The writings of medieval Islamic philosophers like Al-Ghazali and Ibn Sina, with their detailed explorations of mystical states and altered consciousness, provided intellectual legitimacy for the idea that drugs might serve as tools for philosophical investigation rather than mere recreational indulgences. The literary movement known as Orientalism created powerful cultural narratives that further fueled French fascination with Eastern drug culture. Writers like François-René de Chateaubriand, whose Itinéraire de Paris à Jérusalem became a bestseller, painted vivid pictures of Eastern societies where hashish and opium were woven into the fabric of daily life in ways that seemed both exotic and profoundly meaningful. These accounts, while often more imaginative than accurate, created a compelling mythology around Eastern drug use that emphasized its spiritual and creative dimensions rather than its potential for addiction and social harm. The East, as portrayed in French literature, became a realm where consciousness could be deliberately altered to achieve insights unavailable to the purely rational Western mind. The influence of Romantic philosophy provided additional intellectual justification for French interest in consciousness-altering substances. Romantic thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau had already challenged Enlightenment rationalism, arguing that emotion, intuition, and subjective experience were equally valid sources of knowledge about the human condition. The Romantic emphasis on individual experience and the exploration of inner psychological landscapes created a cultural climate that was naturally receptive to substances that promised to expand consciousness and reveal hidden dimensions of reality. French Romantic poets and philosophers saw in Eastern drug culture a practical application of their theoretical commitments, a way of actually experiencing the alternative modes of consciousness that they had been advocating in their writings. The specific appeal of Ottoman and Levantine drug culture lay partly in its apparent sophistication and cultural integration. Unlike the crude alcohol consumption that characterized much of European recreational drug use, Eastern hashish and opium culture seemed to involve elaborate rituals, philosophical frameworks, and social structures that elevated drug use from mere intoxication to something approaching spiritual practice. French travelers returned with accounts of Ottoman intellectuals who used hashish to enhance their appreciation of poetry and music, of Sufi mystics who employed these substances as aids to meditation and prayer, and of Eastern physicians who prescribed opium with a precision and understanding that surpassed anything available in European medicine. The temporal dimension of this fascination was equally important. The East represented not just geographical otherness, but also a connection to humanity's ancient past. French intellectuals, living through an era of unprecedented historical change, were drawn to cultures that seemed to maintain unbroken connections to classical antiquity and medieval wisdom traditions. The use of opium and hashish in Eastern societies could be traced back thousands of years, creating a sense of participating in practices that connected users to the deepest roots of human civilization. This historical continuity offered a powerful antidote to the sense of rootlessness and cultural fragmentation that many French thinkers experienced in their rapidly modernizing society. The scientific revolution of the 18th and early 19th centuries had also created new frameworks for understanding consciousness that made Eastern drug culture seem worthy of serious investigation. The emerging field of psychology, pioneered by figures like Franz Anton Mesmer and his theories of animal magnetism, suggested that human consciousness was far more complex and malleable than previously understood. French intellectuals began to see substances like hashish and opium not as crude intoxicants, but as sophisticated tools for exploring the hidden dimensions of human psychology. The systematic study of altered states of consciousness promised to reveal fundamental truths about the nature of mind, perception, and reality itself. The social and political context of 19th century France also contributed to the appeal of Eastern drug culture. The restoration of the monarchy after Napoleon's defeat had created a sense of political stagnation and cultural conservatism that many intellectuals found stifling. The East, with its different political structures and social arrangements, offered models of alternative ways of organizing society and individual life. The apparent tolerance for consciousness exploration in Eastern cultures contrasted sharply with the moral rigidity and social conformity that characterized post-revolutionary French society, making Eastern drug practices seem like expressions of intellectual and personal freedom. This complex web of cultural, philosophical, and political factors created the perfect conditions for the systematic experimentation with consciousness-altering substances that would characterize Parisian intellectual life throughout the middle decades of the 19th century. The French quest for Eastern otherness had provided both the substances and the intellectual frameworks necessary for an unprecedented exploration of human consciousness, setting the stage for experiments that would profoundly influence European culture and our understanding of the relationship between drugs, creativity, and the human mind. While the intellectual salons of the Club des Hachishins captured the imagination of literary Paris, a parallel and far more extensive opium culture was quietly establishing itself in the shadowy corners of the city, one that would eventually dwarf the exclusive experiments of the artistic elite in both scope and social impact. By the dawn of the 20th century, the romantic notion of drug experimentation as the exclusive province of poets and philosophers had given way to a more complex reality. Opium smoking had become a commercial enterprise that served a diverse clientele, ranging from struggling artists to wealthy bourgeois seeking exotic thrills. This transformation was largely driven by French expatriates returning from the Indochinese colonies, men who had spent years in Saigon, Hanoi, and the remote outposts of French Cochinchina, where opium smoking was not an intellectual curiosity, but a deeply embedded aspect of daily life. These returning colonists brought with them more than just nostalgic memories of tropical evenings and colonial privilege. They carried intimate knowledge of opium preparation techniques, smoking rituals, and den management practices that had been perfected over centuries in the opium houses of Southeast Asia. Unlike the hashish experiments of the literary clubs, which relied on traditional Middle Eastern preparations, the Indochinese smoking method represented a quantum leap in both potency and addictive potential. The process of cooking raw opium into a concentrated paste, then vaporizing it through specially designed pipes, delivered the drug directly to the lungs and bloodstream with an efficiency that made traditional opium eating seem primitive by comparison. These veterans of colonial service understood not just the technical aspects of opium smoking, but also the subtle social dynamics that made successful opium dens function as more than mere drug distribution points. The choice of Montmartre as the epicenter of Parisian opium culture was no accident. This bohemian quarter had already established itself as a refuge for artists, writers, and social outcasts who existed on the margins of respectable Parisian society. The winding streets and hidden courtyards of Montmartre provided perfect cover for establishments that needed to operate discreetly, while the neighborhood's reputation for tolerance and unconventional behavior meant that the strange sweet smoke drifting from certain buildings was unlikely to attract unwanted attention from authorities or moral reformers. The area's existing infrastructure of cafés, cabarets, and boarding houses could easily be adapted to accommodate opium smoking, often with the simple addition of a back room furnished with low couches and proper ventilation. The entrepreneurs who established these dens were typically French colonists who had developed both appreciation for and dependence on opium during their years in Indochina. Many had originally encountered the drug as a medical treatment for tropical diseases like dysentery and malaria, only to discover that what began as therapeutic use gradually evolved into psychological dependence. Others had been drawn into opium culture through their relationships with Vietnamese or Chinese mistresses who introduced them to smoking as a social activity. Regardless of how their initial involvement began, these men returned to France carrying not just personal habits, but also the business knowledge necessary to recreate the opium house experience for European customers. The establishments they created attempted to transport customers psychologically as well as chemically, recreating as faithfully as possible the atmosphere of Far Eastern opium houses. Dim lighting, provided by oil lamps or gas fixtures turned low, created an environment where the harsh realities of Parisian life seemed to fade into irrelevance. Oriental decorations, silk screens, carved wooden panels, brass incense burners, and elaborate rugs transformed ordinary Montmartre rooms into exotic sanctuaries that felt removed from European civilization. The sweet, cloying smell of burning opium, mixed with incense and tobacco smoke, created an olfactory signature that regular customers would recognize and associate with escape from their daily troubles. The drug itself was poetically known as le brun fée, the brown fairy, a nickname that captured both its seductive appeal and its reputation for granting users temporary escape from the harsh realities of urban life. This personification of opium as a benevolent fairy reflected the romantic mythology that surrounded the drug in popular culture, where it was often portrayed as a magical substance that could transport users to realms of beauty and tranquility unavailable in ordinary consciousness. The brown color referred to the concentrated paste that resulted from cooking raw opium, a process that transformed the milky white sap of the poppy into a dark tar-like substance that could be shaped into small pellets for smoking. The clientele of these establishments was far more diverse than the exclusive membership of the literary clubs. Struggling artists and writers, drawn by both curiosity and the hope that opium might enhance their creativity, mingled with wealthy bourgeois seeking exotic experiences that would distinguish them from their conventional peers. Colonial administrators on leave from Indochina came to maintain habits developed overseas, while sailors and merchants who had traveled to the Far East sought to recapture experiences from their voyages. Even respectable middle-class Parisians, particularly those suffering from chronic pain or psychological distress, sometimes found their way to these establishments after conventional medicine had failed to provide relief. The social dynamics within the dens created temporary communities bound together by their shared pursuit of altered consciousness. Unlike the intellectual discussions that characterize the Club des Hashisha, conversation in commercial opium dens tended to be more intimate and confessional. The drug's effects, a profound sense of well-being combined with heightened empathy and reduced social inhibitions, encouraged customers to share personal stories and form connections that might never have developed in conventional social settings. Regular patrons often developed friendships based entirely on their shared experiences in these hidden spaces, creating networks of mutual support that existed parallel to their ordinary social lives. The ritual aspects of opium smoking were as important as the drug's effects themselves. The careful preparation of the pipe, the precise heating of the opium pellet over a small flame, the slow inhalation that required skill and patience. All of these elements contributed to an experience that felt ceremonial rather than merely recreational. Experienced smokers took pride in their technique, and newcomers were often initiated by veterans who shared both practical knowledge and cultural lore about proper opium etiquette. This ritualization helped distinguish opium smoking from crude intoxication, creating a sense that participants were engaging in something approaching spiritual practice. The economic structure of these establishments reflected their dual nature as both businesses and social institutions. Most dens charged not just for the opium itself, but for the entire experience, the use of pipes and other equipment, access to the specially prepared environment, and the social atmosphere that made solitary drug use into a communal activity. Some establishments offered additional services like meals, entertainment, or even lodging for customers who preferred to remain under the influence rather than venture back into the streets of Paris. The most successful dens developed reputations for quality and discretion that allowed them to charge premium prices while maintaining loyal customer bases. By the early 1900s, these commercial opium dens had become an established feature of Parisian underground culture, serving hundreds of regular customers, and introducing thousands more to the seductive appeal of the Brown Ferry. Their existence represented the democratization of consciousness exploration, making experiences that had once been limited to intellectual elites available to anyone with sufficient money and curiosity to seek them out. In the intellectual ferment of 1840s Paris, where revolutionary ideas competed for attention in smoke-filled cafés and gaslit salons, one man's scientific curiosity was about to give birth to history's most famous drug experimentation society. Dr. Jacques-Joseph Moreau de Tours stood at the intersection of medicine, psychology, and adventure, a distinguished psychiatrist whose conventional medical training had been transformed by extraordinary experiences in the mysterious East. His travels through the Ottoman Empire had exposed him to therapeutic traditions that challenged everything European medicine believed about the treatment of mental illness, and he returned to Paris with a revolutionary hypothesis: that the systematic study of drug-induced altered states could unlock fundamental secrets about the nature of human consciousness and mental disease. Moreau's journey to this radical conclusion had begun years earlier when he accompanied a wealthy patient on a therapeutic voyage through the Middle East. A common prescription for nervous disorders among the Parisian elite. What was intended as a conventional medical tour became something far more transformative when Moreau encountered the sophisticated use of cannabis in Islamic medical practice. In the hospitals of Cairo and Damascus, he observed physicians employing hashish not as a crude intoxicant, but as a precise therapeutic instrument, using it to treat conditions ranging from melancholia to epilepsy, with a skill and understanding that surpassed anything available in European medicine. These Eastern doctors possessed detailed knowledge of dosages, preparation methods, and patient selection criteria that had been refined over centuries of clinical experience. The young psychiatrist was particularly struck by the parallels he observed between hashish-induced states and the symptoms of mental illness that he treated in his Parisian practice. Patients under the influence of cannabis exhibited many of the same perceptual distortions, emotional fluctuations, and cognitive alterations that characterized various forms of madness, but in a controlled and temporary form that could be studied systematically. This observation led Moreau to a startling hypothesis. If drugs could artificially reproduce the symptoms of mental illness in healthy individuals, then the careful study of these drug-induced states might reveal the underlying mechanisms of madness itself. The implications were staggering. Rather than simply treating mental illness after it appeared, physicians might be able to understand its fundamental nature and perhaps even prevent its occurrence. Upon his return to Paris in the early 1840s, Moreau found himself in possession of both theoretical insights and practical materials that positioned him uniquely to pursue this revolutionary research agenda. He had brought back substantial quantities of high-quality hashish, along with detailed knowledge of preparation methods and consumption rituals that he had learned from Middle Eastern physicians. More importantly, he had developed a scientific framework for understanding drug experimentation, not as recreational indulgence, but as serious medical research that could advance the treatment of mental illness. The challenge lay in finding appropriate subjects for his experiments, individuals whose intelligence and observational skills would allow them to provide meaningful data about their drug-induced experiences. The solution came to Moreau through his connections in Parisian intellectual society, where his reputation as both a distinguished physician and a world traveler had earned him entree to the most sophisticated circles of the capital. He recognized that the city's literary and artistic elite possessed exactly the combination of intellectual sophistication, creative sensitivity, and adventurous spirit that his research required. These were individuals who had already dedicated their lives to exploring the furthest reaches of human experience through their art, and who possessed the verbal skills necessary to articulate the subtle nuances of altered consciousness. Moreover, their social position provided them with the discretion and independence necessary to participate in experiments that conventional society might view with suspicion. The founding of the Club des Hachishans around 1844 represented Moreau's masterstroke in organizing this research agenda into a sustainable and productive format. Rather than conducting isolated experiments with individual subjects, he created a social institution that would allow for systematic, repeated observations of drug effects under controlled conditions. The club format served multiple purposes. It provided social support for participants during potentially challenging experiences. It created opportunities for comparative analysis of different individuals' responses to the same substances, and it established a regular schedule of meetings that would generate substantial data over time. Moreau's vision for the club extended far beyond simple drug experimentation. He sought to create what might be called the world's first psychopharmacological research laboratory, albeit one disguised as a gentleman's social club. His medical training had taught him the importance of careful observation and detailed record-keeping, and he encouraged club members to document their experiences with scientific precision. The monthly meetings were structured to maximize both the quality of the drug experiences and the value of the data they generated, with Moreau serving simultaneously as research director, medical supervisor, and participant observer. The psychiatrist's recruitment strategy focused on individuals whose creative work already demonstrated unusual sensitivity to psychological states and whose intellectual curiosity would drive them to explore drug effects with genuine scientific interest. He understood that the success of his experiments depended not just on the quality of the hashish, but on the quality of the minds that would be studying its effects. The literary figures he attracted to the club were already engaged in their own explorations of consciousness through their writing, making them natural collaborators in a project that promised to expand the boundaries of human self-knowledge. The scientific legitimacy that Moreau brought to the enterprise was crucial in attracting participants who might otherwise have been reluctant to engage in what could easily be dismissed as mere hedonistic indulgence. His medical credentials and serious research agenda transformed drug experimentation from a potentially scandalous activity into a form of scientific inquiry that could be pursued with intellectual pride. The club members understood that they were participating not just in novel experiences, but in groundbreaking research that might revolutionize the understanding of human consciousness and mental illness. Moreau's own participation in the experiments demonstrated his commitment to the scientific principles of direct observation and personal involvement that characterized the best research of his era. Unlike modern researchers who maintain strict separation between investigator and subject, Moreau believed that understanding drug effects required first-hand experience of their subjective dimensions. His willingness to serve as both researcher and research subject established a model of participatory investigation that would influence drug research for decades to come. The founding of the Club des Hachishans thus represented more than the creation of a social club for drug experimentation. It marked the birth of systematic psychopharmacological research and the beginning of serious scientific inquiry into the relationship between drugs and consciousness. Moreau's vision of using controlled drug experiences to understand mental illness was decades ahead of its time, anticipating research approaches that would not become mainstream until the mid-20th century. The club he founded would become a legendary institution whose influence extended far beyond its immediate participants, shaping both scientific understanding of psychoactive drugs and cultural attitudes toward consciousness exploration for generations to come. Rising from the gentle waters of the Seine like a Baroque jewel set in the heart of Paris, the Hôtel de Lauzun stood as one of the capital's most magnificent private residences, its elegant facade concealing secrets that would have scandalized the respectable bourgeois families who passed beneath its windows each day. Known in the 1840s as the Hôtel Pimodan, this 17th-century mansion occupied a commanding position on the Île Saint-Louis, that narrow island which seemed to float between the bustling commercial districts of the right bank and the intellectual ferment of the Latin Quarter. The choice of this particular location for the Club des Hachishans' monthly séances was no mere accident of convenience. It represented a deliberate selection of a space that embodied the very essence of what the club sought to achieve, a realm apart from ordinary reality, where the boundaries between the material and spiritual worlds could be safely explored. The mansion's history was as rich and complex as the experiences that would unfold within its walls during the hashish experiments. Built in the 1650s for Charles Gruin de Bourg, a wealthy financier who had made his fortune in the lucrative but morally questionable business of tax farming, the building had been designed to showcase both wealth and sophistication in equal measure. The architect, Louis Levaux, who would later help design the Palace of Versailles, had created a masterpiece of French classical architecture that combined imposing grandeur with intimate elegance. The mansion's facade, with its perfectly proportioned windows and ornate stone carvings, announced the importance of its inhabitants while maintaining the discretion that wealthy Parisians valued above all else. By the time Dr. Moreau selected it as the venue for his experiments, the Hôtel Pimodan had passed through several hands and acquired a reputation as a haven for artists and intellectuals who existed on the margins of conventional Parisian society. The building's current residents included some of the most creative and unconventional figures in the capital, individuals who were drawn to the mansion not just by its architectural beauty, but by its atmosphere of tolerance and intellectual freedom. This bohemian character made it the perfect setting for activities that respectable society might view with suspicion, while its prestigious address and elegant appointments ensured that participants would feel they were engaging in something elevated rather than merely transgressive. Théophile Gautier's famous description of the mansion as a sort of oasis of solitude in the middle of Paris captured perfectly the psychological transformation that occurred when one crossed its threshold. Despite being located in the very heart of the world's most sophisticated city, the Hotel Pimadon seemed to exist in a different temporal and spatial dimension, where the urgent rhythms of modern urban life gave way to a more contemplative pace that encouraged introspection and philosophical reflection. The building's position on the Ile Saint-Louis contributed significantly to this sense of separation, surrounded by the flowing waters of the Seine. It felt like a private island where different rules might apply and where consciousness could be safely altered, without fear of intrusion from the outside world. The mansion's interior had been carefully arranged to enhance this sense of otherworldly sanctuary. The rooms designated for the hashish seances were decorated in a style that deliberately evoked the Orient, with Turkish carpets covering polished parquet floors. Silk cushions scattered on low divans and brass incense burners, filling the air with exotic fragrances that transported visitors psychologically before they had even consumed any substances. Heavy curtains blocked out the harsh Parisian daylight, while oil lamps and candles provided a warm, flickering illumination that seemed to make the ornate wallpaper and painted ceilings come alive with dancing shadows. The overall effect was to create an environment that felt removed not just from the streets of Paris, but from European civilization itself. The architectural features of the building contributed to its effectiveness as a venue for consciousness exploration. The high ceilings and spacious rooms provided a sense of grandeur that elevated the drug experiences above mere recreational indulgence, while the thick walls and heavy doors ensured privacy and prevented the sounds of the seances from disturbing neighbors or attracting unwanted attention. The mansion's multiple levels and complex layout created opportunities for participants to find private spaces for individual reflection when the intensity of group experiences became overwhelming, while the central salon provided a communal gathering place where shared visions could be discussed and compared. The location's historical associations added another layer of meaning to the hashish experiments. The Ile Saint-Louis had long been associated with religious contemplation and spiritual retreat. The island had once housed several monasteries and convents whose inhabitants had dedicated their lives to exploring altered states of consciousness through prayer, fasting, and meditation. The Club des Hashishins was, in a sense, continuing this tradition of consciousness exploration, albeit through chemical rather than purely spiritual means. The participants were aware of these historical resonances, and many felt that they were participating in a tradition of seeking transcendence that connected them to centuries of spiritual seekers who had found refuge on this small island in the Seine. The practical advantages of the location were equally important to the success of the experiments. The mansion's prestigious address and elegant appointments attracted participants who might have been reluctant to visit a less respectable venue, while its reputation as an artistic salon provided perfect cover for the monthly gatherings. Neighbors and casual observers would assume that the regular meetings were simply another example of the intellectual soirees that were common among the Parisian cultural elite, never suspecting that consciousness-altering substances were being systematically explored behind the mansion's elegant facade. The seasonal rhythms of Parisian life added another dimension to the club's use of the space. During the long winter months when darkness fell early and the city's social life moved indoors, the warm, lamp-lit rooms of the Hotel Pimadon provided a perfect refuge from the cold and gloom of the streets outside. The contrast between the harsh external environment and the luxurious internal sanctuary enhanced the psychological impact of the hashish experiences, making participants feel that they had truly entered a different world where ordinary concerns and constraints no longer applied. The building's relationship to the surrounding cityscape was equally significant. From the mansion's windows, participants could observe the life of Paris flowing past on both banks of the Seine, the merchants and workers going about their daily business, the carriages of the wealthy rolling through the streets, the students and intellectuals gathering in the cafés of the Latin Quarter. This visual connection to ordinary reality served as both anchor and contrast during the drug experiences, reminding participants of the world they had temporarily left behind, while emphasizing the extraordinary nature of the consciousness states they were exploring within the mansion's walls. The Hotel Pimodan thus served as more than merely a convenient meeting place. It was an integral component of the hashish experiments, a carefully chosen environment that enhanced and shaped the experiences of all who participated in the Club des Hashishins. Revolutionary exploration of human consciousness. The monthly gatherings at the Hotel Pimodan brought together what can only be described as the most extraordinary constellation of literary talent ever assembled for the purpose of consciousness exploration. Dr. Moreau's recruitment efforts had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations, attracting not merely curious intellectuals, but the very architects of French Romantic literature, men whose names would echo through the centuries and whose works would define the cultural identity of an entire nation. These were not dilettantes seeking fashionable thrills, but serious artists at the height of their creative powers, drawn to hashish experimentation by the same restless curiosity and hunger for transcendent experience that fueled their greatest literary achievements. Charles Baudelaire arrived at the club already carrying within him the seeds of the dark genius that would produce Les Fleurs du Mal, though few could have predicted the revolutionary impact his poetry would have on world literature. At 23, he possessed an intensity and psychological penetration that made him an ideal subject for consciousness exploration, combined with a morbid fascination with the darker aspects of human experience that drew him naturally to substances that promised to reveal hidden dimensions of reality. Baudelaire approached the hashish experiments with the same methodical precision he brought to his poetry, treating each séance as an opportunity to map the furthest territories of human consciousness. His participation was driven not by hedonistic impulses, but by a genuine desire to understand the relationship between artificial stimulation and artistic inspiration, a question that would haunt him throughout his career and ultimately contribute to his tragic end. Théophile Gautier brought to the club the sensibilities of both poet and art critic, possessing an almost supernatural ability to translate visual and sensory experiences into precise, evocative language. His background as a painter before turning to literature had trained his eye to observe subtle gradations of color, light, and form that others might miss, making him an invaluable chronicler of hashish's effects on perception. Gautier's participation in the club was motivated by his belief that art should appeal to all the senses simultaneously, and he saw in hashish a tool for achieving the kind of synesthetic experiences that he tried to create through his writing. His famous account of the club's activities, published in 1846, would become the definitive contemporary record of these experiments, capturing with remarkable precision the progression of sensations and visions that characterized the hashish experience. Alexandre Dumas père, already famous for The Three Musketeers and The Count of Monte Cristo, brought to the gatherings the adventurous spirit and boundless curiosity that characterized his swashbuckling heroes. His participation reflected his lifelong fascination with exotic experiences and foreign cultures, as well as his belief that a writer must personally experience everything he hoped to describe convincingly in his fiction. Dumas approached the hashish experiments with the same enthusiasm he brought to his travels and his writing, seeing them as research for future literary projects as much as personal exploration. His presence at the club also provided a connection to the commercial literary world, as his enormous popular success had made him one of the most influential figures in Parisian publishing. Victor Hugo's involvement with the club was more sporadic, but no less significant, reflecting both his towering status in French literature and his cautious approach to activities that might compromise his public reputation. Already the author of Notre Dame de Paris and well on his way to completing Les Misérables, Hugo was perhaps the most famous writer in France, making his participation in drug experiments both more valuable and more risky than that of his younger colleagues. His interest in the club stemmed from his fascination with the supernatural and the mystical themes that permeated much of his work and reflected his belief that literature should explore the full range of human experience, including its most mysterious and transcendent dimensions. Gérard de Nerval brought to the gatherings a mind already teetering on the edge of madness, making him both the most vulnerable and potentially the most insightful participant in the experiments. His lifelong struggle with what would now be recognized as bipolar disorder had given him intimate knowledge of altered states of consciousness, and he saw in hashish a way to explore and perhaps understand the visions and delusions that periodically overwhelmed his rational mind. Nerval's participation was particularly valuable to Dr. Moreau's research, as it provided opportunities to observe how hashish affected someone already predisposed to psychological instability. His tragic fate, he would eventually commit suicide in 1855, served as a sobering reminder of the dangers inherent in consciousness exploration, particularly for those whose grip on reality was already tenuous. Honoré de Balzac's relationship with the club was more complex and ambivalent than that of his colleagues, reflecting his fundamentally practical nature and his concerns about anything that might interfere with his prodigious literary productivity. The author of La Comédie Humaine was driven by an almost superhuman work ethic that left little time for recreational activities, and he approached the hashish experiments with the same analytical mindset he brought to his detailed observations of French society. Balzac was particularly interested in hashish's effects on creativity and mental acuity, hoping to determine whether the drug might enhance his already formidable powers of observation and analysis. However, his experiences with the substance ultimately convinced him that artificial stimulation was inferior to the natural inspiration that fueled his best work. The presence of these literary giants at the club's gatherings created an atmosphere of intellectual excitement that elevated the hashish experiments far above mere recreational drug use. These men were accustomed to pushing the boundaries of human experience through their writing, and they brought the same fearless curiosity to their exploration of consciousness-altering substances. Their conversations during the séances, as recorded by participants like Gautier, revealed minds grappling with fundamental questions about the nature of reality, creativity, and human consciousness that would influence philosophical and psychological thought for generations to come. The diversity of personalities and literary styles represented in the club's membership ensured that the hashish experiences would be interpreted and recorded from multiple perspectives, creating a rich archive of subjective reports that captured the full range of the drug's effects. Each writer brought his own unique sensibility to the experiments: Baudelaire's psychological penetration, Gautier's sensory precision, Dumas' adventurous enthusiasm, Hugo's mystical inclinations, Nerval's visionary intensity, and Balzac's analytical rigor. This variety of approaches provided Dr. Moreau with invaluable data about how individual personality and creative temperament influenced responses to consciousness-altering substances. The club's roster also included numerous other significant figures from Parisian intellectual life, creating a network of influence that extended far beyond the immediate participants. These included painters, musicians, critics, and philosophers who contributed their own perspectives to the ongoing exploration of hashish's effects on human consciousness. The presence of such distinguished company helped legitimize the experiments in the eyes of Parisian society, transforming what might otherwise have been seen as scandalous behavior into serious scientific and artistic research. The long-term impact of these literary giants' participation in the Club des Associations extended far beyond the immediate experiences of the seances themselves. Their writings about consciousness, perception, and the relationship between artificial stimulation and creativity would influence generations of artists and thinkers, while their personal struggles with addiction and mental illness would serve as cautionary tales about the dangers of consciousness exploration. The club's membership represented not just a gathering of talented individuals, but a crucial moment in the history of literature when some of the greatest minds of the age came together to explore the furthest frontiers of human experience. The final ingredient, pistachios, represented both a practical and aesthetic choice that reflected the sophisticated culinary traditions of North Africa. These nuts were carefully shelled and chopped into small pieces before being incorporated into the cooling paste, where they provided textural contrast and a subtle nutty flavor that complemented the other ingredients. The pistachios also served a practical purpose, as their oils contributed additional fat content that aided in the absorption of the cannabis compounds. From an aesthetic standpoint, the pale green nuts created an attractive visual contrast against the darker green of the cannabis-infused paste, making the final product appear more like an exotic delicacy than a crude drug preparation. The finished dawamesque had the consistency of a thick, malleable paste that could be easily shaped into individual portions for consumption. Each dose was typically formed into a small ball or cube, roughly the size of a large grape, containing what Dr. Moreau had calculated to be an appropriate amount of cannabis for producing the desired consciousness-altering effects without risking dangerous overdose. The preparation's appearance was both appetizing and mysterious. The greenish color immediately identified it as something unusual, while the visible pieces of pistachio and the smooth, glossy surface created by the honey and fat made it appear almost like an exotic confection that might be served at a sophisticated dinner party. The consumption ritual itself was as carefully orchestrated as the preparation process, reflecting Dr. Moreau's understanding that the psychological context of drug use was crucial to the resulting experience. Club members gathered in the elegantly appointed salon of the Hotel Pimodan, where the atmosphere had been carefully prepared to enhance the coming journey into altered consciousness. The room was dimly lit by oil lamps and candles, creating dancing shadows that would later seem to take on lives of their own under the influence of the dawamesque. Oriental carpets and silk cushions provided comfortable seating arrangements that encouraged relaxation and introspection, while incense burners filled the air with exotic fragrances that transported participants psychologically toward the east even before they had consumed any substances. Dr. Moreau would personally distribute the individual portions of dawamesque, explaining to each participant what they could expect to experience and providing guidance on how to maximize the benefits while minimizing potential risks. The act of consumption itself was treated with appropriate solemnity. Participants understood that they were not merely indulging in recreational pleasure, but participating in a serious scientific experiment that might advance human understanding of consciousness and creativity. The paste was typically consumed by placing it on the tongue and allowing it to dissolve slowly, mixing with saliva before being swallowed. This method ensured gradual absorption and helped prevent the nausea that could result from consuming large amounts of the rich, fatty preparation too quickly. The taste of dawamesque was complex and distinctive, combining the earthy bitterness of cannabis with the sweetness of honey and the nutty richness of pistachios, all bound together by the fatty medium that carried the psychoactive compounds. Most participants found the flavor pleasant enough, though some required time to develop an appreciation for its unique characteristics. The texture was smooth and creamy, dissolving easily in the mouth and leaving a lingering aftertaste that served as a reminder of the extraordinary journey that was about to begin. The timing of consumption was carefully coordinated to ensure that all participants would experience the peak effects simultaneously, creating opportunities for shared visions and collective exploration of altered consciousness that formed the heart of the club's experimental program. The transformation of raw cannabis into the mystical confection known as dawamesk represented far more than mere pharmaceutical preparation. It was an alchemical process that connected the Parisian experimenters to centuries of North African tradition while creating a substance that seemed to bridge the gap between medicine and magic. The very name dawamesk carried exotic resonances that transported club members psychologically before they had even tasted the greenish paste, evoking images of Algerian markets, Berber tribesmen, and ancient wisdom traditions that had perfected this preparation over countless generations. Dr. Moreau's decision to employ this traditional method rather than experimenting with European pharmaceutical techniques reflected his deep respect for the cultural knowledge he had encountered during his travels, as well as his understanding that the ritual aspects of drug consumption were as important as the chemical effects themselves. The preparation of dawamesk began with the careful selection and processing of cannabis resin, a substance that the Algerians called keef, and that represented the concentrated essence of the hemp plant's psychoactive properties. This resin, appearing as a dark, sticky substance with an almost tar-like consistency, was obtained through a laborious process of sifting and pressing cannabis flowers that had been carefully cultivated and harvested at the peak of their potency. The quality of the resin was crucial to the final product's effectiveness, and Dr. Moreau took great care to ensure that only the finest specimens were used in the club's experiments. The resin's appearance, dark green to brown in color, with an oily texture that left residue on the fingers, gave little indication of the profound consciousness-altering properties it contained. The transformation of this raw resin into consumable dawamesk required both technical skill and cultural knowledge that Dr. Moreau had acquired during his extensive travels in Algeria. The process began with the careful heating of animal fat, typically butter or clarified butter, which served as both a solvent for the cannabis resin and a medium that would facilitate its absorption in the human digestive system. The fat had to be heated to precisely the right temperature, hot enough to dissolve the resin completely, but not so hot as to destroy the delicate psychoactive compounds that gave the preparation its power. This heating process filled the preparation room with a distinctive aroma that combined the earthy, herbal scent of cannabis with the rich smell of cooking fat, creating an olfactory signature that club members would forever associate with their consciousness-expanding adventures. Once the fat reached the proper temperature, the cannabis resin was gradually incorporated, requiring constant stirring and careful attention to ensure complete dissolution. This stage of the preparation was critical, as incomplete mixing could result in uneven distribution of the active compounds, leading to unpredictable effects when the final product was consumed. The mixture had to be stirred continuously as it cooled, preventing the resin from separating and ensuring that each portion of the final product would contain a consistent dose of psychoactive material. The resulting combination had a distinctive greenish color that gave dawamesk its characteristic appearance, while the texture remained smooth and paste-like, suitable for easy consumption. The addition of honey served multiple purposes beyond mere flavoring, though its sweetness was certainly welcome in masking the bitter, earthy taste of cannabis that many European palates found unpleasant. Honey acted as a natural preservative, extending the shelf life of the preparation and preventing spoilage that could render the expensive cannabis resin useless. More importantly, the natural sugars in honey were believed to enhance the absorption of the psychoactive compounds, potentially increasing both the speed of onset and the intensity of effects. The honey also contributed to the paste's smooth texture, making it easier to shape into individual doses and more pleasant to consume than the raw resin would have been. Théophile Gautier's 1846 article Le Club des Hashishiens stands as one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of consciousness exploration, a literary masterpiece that captured with unprecedented precision and poetic eloquence the subjective experience of hashish intoxication. Writing with the dual perspective of participant and observer, Gautier transformed what could have been merely a sensational account of drug experimentation into a profound meditation on the nature of perception, reality, and human consciousness itself. His documentation was driven by more than scientific curiosity or literary ambition. It represented a serious attempt to map the uncharted territories of the mind using the tools of precise observation and artistic expression that had made him one of France's most respected critics and poets. Gautier approached his role as chronicler of the club's experiments with the methodical precision of a scientist combined with the aesthetic sensitivity of an artist who had spent years training his eye to observe subtle gradations of color, light, and form. His background as both painter and poet had equipped him with an unusually rich vocabulary for describing sensory experiences, while his work as an art critic had developed his ability to analyze and articulate complex aesthetic phenomena. These skills proved invaluable when applied to the challenge of documenting hashish's effects, which seemed to exist at the very limits of language's ability to capture and convey subjective experience. The progression of effects that Gautier documented began with what he termed the fantasias, a stage characterized by the dramatic amplification of ordinary perceptions that transformed the familiar salon of the Hôtel Pimodin into a realm of wonder and mystery. Colors became more vivid and seemed to pulse with inner life, while sounds took on new dimensions of richness and complexity that revealed hidden harmonies in the most mundane noises. The ticking of a clock might become a symphony of mechanical precision, while the rustle of silk clothing could sound like wind through enchanted forests. Gautier described how ordinary objects seemed to reveal secret meanings and hidden connections, as if the hashish had lifted a veil that normally obscured the true nature of reality. During these initial stages, Gautier observed that his sense of time became profoundly distorted, with minutes stretching into what felt like hours, while entire conversations seemed to occur in the space of a single heartbeat. This temporal displacement created a dreamlike quality to the experience, where cause and effect relationships became fluid, and the normal logic of sequential events gave way to a more associative, poetic form of consciousness. Participants found themselves able to follow complex chains of thought and imagery that would have been impossible to sustain under normal circumstances, as if the hashish had temporarily enhanced their mental capacity while simultaneously altering the fundamental structure of their thinking. The visual hallucinations that characterized the fantasias were unlike anything Gautier had previously experienced or imagined. Rather than simple distortions of existing objects, the hashish seemed to generate entirely new visual phenomena that appeared to exist independently of external stimuli. Geometric patterns of extraordinary complexity and beauty would materialize in the air, shifting and evolving with mathematical precision while displaying color combinations that seemed impossible in the natural world. These visions possessed a quality of hyperreality that made them appear more vivid and substantial than ordinary perception, leading participants to question which state of consciousness provided more accurate access to truth. As the effects intensified, Gautier documented his entry into what he termed the state of Kif, a condition of perfect beatitude that represented the pinnacle of the hashish experience. This Arabic word, borrowed from the drug culture of North Africa, described a state of consciousness characterized by complete contentment, universal love, and profound spiritual insight that seemed to dissolve all boundaries between self and cosmos. In this state, Gautier reported feeling connected not just to his immediate surroundings, but to the entire universe, experiencing a sense of unity and understanding that transcended ordinary human consciousness. The Kiev state brought with it what Gautier described as a form of enhanced empathy that allowed him to perceive the inner emotional states of his fellow club members with startling clarity. Conversations took on layers of meaning that seemed to reveal universal truths about human nature and the cosmos, while simple gestures and expressions conveyed profound philosophical insights. The normal barriers between individual consciousness seemed to dissolve, creating a sense of collective awareness where the thoughts and feelings of all participants became accessible to each other in ways that defied rational explanation. During these peak experiences, Gautier found that his creative faculties were dramatically enhanced, with ideas and images flowing through his consciousness with unprecedented clarity and originality. He described feeling as if he had access to a vast library of knowledge and inspiration that was normally hidden from conscious awareness, allowing him to make connections and generate insights that would have been impossible under ordinary circumstances. This creative enhancement was accompanied by a profound sense of aesthetic appreciation that made even the most mundane objects appear beautiful and meaningful, as if the hashish had revealed the inherent artistry that existed in all aspects of reality. However, Gautier's documentation also captured the darker aspects of the hashish experience, particularly what he termed the final nightmare that often concluded the evening's experiments. As the effects of the dawamesque began to wane, the same heightened perceptions that had earlier produced ecstasy could transform into sources of terror and confusion. The enhanced sensitivity to sensory input that had revealed hidden beauties in ordinary objects could also amplify fears and anxieties, creating a feedback loop of negative emotions that seemed impossible to escape. These nightmarish episodes often involved what Gautier described as a complete loss of personal identity, where participants became convinced that they had permanently lost their sanity or that time had stopped entirely, trapping them forever in their altered state. The same dissolution of boundaries between self and environment that had produced feelings of cosmic unity during the Kiev state could become a source of existential terror when experienced through the lens of fear rather than wonder. Participants might find themselves unable to distinguish between their own thoughts and external reality, leading to panic attacks that could last for hours. Gautier's careful documentation of these negative experiences was as valuable as his descriptions of the positive effects, providing crucial insights into the full spectrum of hashish's impact on human consciousness. His accounts revealed that the drug's effects were highly dependent on psychological context, with the same neurochemical changes producing radically different subjective experiences depending on the participant's mental state and environmental conditions. This observation would prove prophetic, anticipating modern research into the importance of set and setting in determining the outcomes of psychedelic experiences. The literary quality of Gautier's documentation elevated his account far above mere scientific reporting, creating a work of art that captured not just the facts of hashish intoxication, but its essential spirit and meaning. His prose style, with its rich imagery and precise attention to sensory detail, provided readers with a vicarious experience of consciousness alteration that was almost as vivid as direct participation. This artistic achievement ensured that his account would influence not just scientific understanding of psychoactive drugs, but also literary and cultural attitudes toward consciousness exploration for generations to come. In 1860, 15 years after his first encounters with hashish at the Club des Hashishins, Charles Baudelaire published what would become one of the most influential and controversial books ever written about consciousness-altering substances. Les Paradis Artificiels emerged not as a celebration of drug-induced ecstasy, but as a profound meditation on the relationship between artificial stimulation and authentic human experience, written by a man who had paid the ultimate price for his explorations into the furthest territories of consciousness. The book's immediate critical acclaim reflected not just Baudelaire's literary genius, but also the sophisticated philosophical framework he brought to questions that had previously been addressed primarily through sensational journalism or dry medical reports. Baudelaire's approach to documenting his experiences with wine, opium, and hashish was fundamentally different from the enthusiastic accounts that had characterized earlier writings about the Club des Hachishins. Where Gautier had focused on the wonder and beauty of altered consciousness, Baudelaire brought a darker, more analytical perspective that examined both the seductive appeal and the ultimate futility of seeking transcendence through chemical means. His writing was informed by years of personal struggle with addiction, financial ruin, and the gradual recognition that the artificial paradises he had once pursued with such enthusiasm were ultimately mirages that led away from rather than toward genuine spiritual and artistic fulfillment. The structure of artificial paradises reflected Baudelaire's systematic approach to understanding the psychology of intoxication. The first section, devoted to wine, established his theoretical framework by examining humanity's oldest and most socially accepted form of consciousness alteration. Baudelaire argued that wine represented a relatively benign form of artificial paradise because it enhanced rather than replaced natural human emotions and perceptions. Under the influence of wine, he observed, people became more themselves rather than fundamentally different beings, with their existing personality traits amplified rather than transformed. This analysis provided a baseline against which he could measure the more dramatic alterations produced by opium and hashish. The book's treatment of opium drew heavily on Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, which Baudelaire had translated into French and which had profoundly influenced his understanding of drug addiction as both a creative catalyst and a destructive force. However, Baudelaire's analysis went far beyond de Quincey's romantic portrayal of opium dreams, examining the drug's effects with the clinical precision of someone who had witnessed its devastating impact on his own life and the lives of his contemporaries. He described opium's ability to create what he termed gorgeous, yet false, worlds of ecstasy, realms of experience so beautiful and compelling that they made ordinary reality seem pale and inadequate by comparison. Baudelaire's documentation of opium's effects revealed his deep understanding of the drug's psychological mechanisms. He observed that opium did not simply produce pleasure, but rather created an artificial sense of well-being that seemed to solve all of life's problems without actually addressing any of them. Under opium's influence, users experienced what felt like profound insights into the nature of existence, cosmic revelations that seemed to unlock the secrets of the universe. However, Baudelaire noted with bitter irony, these insights invariably proved to be illusions that dissolved upon sober reflection, leaving users with nothing but the memory of having felt wise and the desperate desire to recapture that feeling. The section on hashish drew directly from Baudelaire's experiences at the Club des Hachishins, but his perspective had been fundamentally altered by the intervening years of reflection and personal struggle. Where he had once approached hashish experimentation with the enthusiasm of a young poet seeking new sources of inspiration, he now viewed these experiences through the lens of hard-won wisdom about the relationship between artificial stimulation and authentic creativity. His descriptions of hashish's effects were no less vivid than Gautier's, but they were infused with a melancholy awareness of the ultimate emptiness that lay beneath the drug's seductive promises. Baudelaire's analysis of hashish revealed his sophisticated understanding of the drug's impact on perception and cognition. He described how hashish seemed to dissolve the normal boundaries between different sensory modalities, creating synesthetic experiences where sounds became visible and colors produced audible harmonies. Time became elastic under hashish's influence, with minutes stretching into subjective hours, while entire philosophical systems could be constructed and demolished in what felt like moments. The drug enhanced pattern recognition to an extraordinary degree, allowing users to perceive connections and correspondences that normally remained hidden, though Baudelaire questioned whether these perceived connections represented genuine insights or merely the brain's tendency to find meaning in random phenomena. The concept of artificial paradises that gave the book its title reflected Baudelaire's central thesis about the fundamental problem with drug-induced transcendence. These chemically generated states of consciousness, no matter how beautiful or profound they might seem, were ultimately false because they were not earned through genuine spiritual or intellectual development. The paradises created by drugs were artificial in the deepest sense. They provided the experience of transcendence without the personal growth that should accompany such experiences, offering shortcuts to enlightenment that ultimately led nowhere. Baudelaire's critique of artificial paradises was informed by his deep Catholic sensibility and his belief that genuine spiritual experience required suffering, struggle, and moral development. The ease with which drugs could produce states that resembled mystical experiences struck him as fundamentally blasphemous, a form of spiritual counterfeiting that debased the currency of authentic religious experience. He argued that the artificial paradises created by drugs were not just false, but actively harmful, because they satisfied the human hunger for transcendence with empty calories that left the soul malnourished and increasingly dependent on external stimulation. The book's immediate critical acclaim reflected both its literary merits and its timely engagement with questions that were becoming increasingly urgent as drug use spread throughout European society. Critics praised Baudelaire's unflinching honesty about his own experiences, his sophisticated psychological analysis, and his ability to transform personal confession into universal insight. The work was recognized as a masterpiece of introspective literature that combined the precision of scientific observation with the emotional depth of great poetry. However, the book's reception was also complicated by its author's reputation and the controversial nature of its subject matter. Some critics worried that Baudelaire's vivid descriptions of drug-induced experiences might encourage experimentation among impressionable readers, while others questioned whether someone so obviously damaged by his own drug use could provide reliable guidance about these substances. These concerns reflected broader social anxieties about the spread of drug culture and the role that literature might play in either promoting or discouraging such experimentation. Artificial Paradises ultimately stands as both a literary masterpiece and a prophetic warning about the seductive dangers of consciousness-altering substances. Baudelaire's analysis of the psychology of intoxication anticipated many insights that would not be formally recognized by psychology and neuroscience for another century, while his moral and spiritual critique of artificial transcendence remains as relevant today as it was in 1860. The book's enduring influence reflects not just its author's literary genius, but also the universal human struggle to find meaning and transcendence in a world that often seems to offer neither. At the heart of Baudelaire's mature understanding of consciousness-altering substances lay a profound philosophical distinction that would torment him throughout his career and ultimately shape his tragic relationship with both creativity and addiction. His famous observation that wine exalts the will, hashish destroys it, represented far more than a casual comparison between different intoxicants. It articulated a fundamental tension between the demands of artistic productivity and the seductive appeal of consciousness-altering experiences that promise to unlock new realms of perception and inspiration. For Baudelaire, this distinction became a matter of existential urgency as he struggled to reconcile his role as a productive writer with his deep fascination for substances that seemed to offer shortcuts to the transcendent experiences that fueled his greatest poetry. The concept of will occupied a central position in Baudelaire's understanding of both artistic creation and human dignity. Influenced by the philosophical currents of his time, particularly the writings of Edgar Allan Poe and the German Romantic philosophers, Baudelaire viewed the will as the essential faculty that distinguished humans from animals and enabled the transformation of raw experience into art. The will was what allowed poets to impose order on chaos, to extract meaning from suffering, and to create beauty from the most unpromising materials. Without a strong and disciplined will, Baudelaire believed, even the most gifted individual would remain trapped in a state of passive receptivity, unable to transform their experiences into lasting artistic achievements. Wine, in Baudelaire's analysis, represented a form of intoxication that was fundamentally compatible with creative productivity because it enhanced rather than replaced the natural operations of human consciousness. Under wine's influence, he observed, the personality became more itself rather than something fundamentally different. Inhibitions were lowered, emotions were intensified, and social barriers were dissolved. But the essential structure of individual identity remained intact. Wine made people more eloquent, more passionate, and more willing to take creative risks. But it did not fundamentally alter their capacity for purposeful action or sustained effort. A writer under wine's influence might produce work that was more spontaneous and emotionally direct than usual, but the work would still bear the unmistakable stamp of their individual personality and artistic vision. The effects of hashish and opium, by contrast, seemed to Baudelaire to represent a fundamental assault on the very foundations of creative will. These substances did not merely enhance existing capacities, but appeared to replace normal consciousness with something entirely different, a state of passive receptivity where the user became a spectator to their own mental processes rather than an active agent capable of directing and shaping their thoughts. Under the influence of hashish, Baudelaire observed, users experienced what felt like profound insights and cosmic revelations. But these experiences were characterized by a dreamlike quality that made sustained intellectual effort impossible. The drug created a state of consciousness that was all reception and no production, all inspiration and no perspiration. This distinction had profound implications for Baudelaire's understanding of authentic creativity. He had come to believe that genuine artistic achievement required not just inspiration, but also the disciplined application of will over extended periods of time. The greatest poetry, in his view, emerged from the tension between spontaneous inspiration and careful craftsmanship, between the initial flash of insight and the patient work of revision and refinement that transformed raw material into finished art. Hashish and opium, by destroying the capacity for sustained effort, seemed to offer only half of this equation. They could provide inspiration in abundance, but they left users incapable of the hard work necessary to transform that inspiration into lasting artistic achievement. The practical implications of this philosophical insight became increasingly apparent to Baudelaire as he observed the effects of drug use on his own productivity and that of his contemporaries. During periods of heavy hashish or opium use, he found himself capable of experiencing extraordinary states of consciousness that seemed to reveal profound truths about existence, but he was unable to capture these insights in writing or to sustain the focused attention necessary for serious literary work. The drugs created a cruel paradox. They seemed to offer access to exactly the kind of transcendent experiences that great poetry should express, but they simultaneously destroyed the capacity to express anything at all. This paradox was particularly torturous for someone of Baudelaire's temperament and ambitions. As a poet who had dedicated his life to exploring the furthest reaches of human experience, he was naturally drawn to substances that promised to expand consciousness and reveal hidden dimensions of reality. The visions and insights produced by hashish and opium seemed to offer raw material for poetry that would surpass anything achievable through ordinary consciousness. Yet the more he pursued these artificial paradises, the less capable he became of the sustained creative work that would have allowed him to transform his experiences into lasting art. The social dimension of this conflict added another layer of complexity to Baudelaire's struggle. The transformation of drug users into what he termed idlers was not merely a personal tragedy, but a social phenomenon that threatened the very foundations of cultural productivity. Baudelaire observed that hashish and opium use seemed to create a class of individuals who were content to experience rather than create, to consume rather than produce, to dream rather than work. These substances, he feared, were creating a generation of passive aesthetes who mistook the experience of beauty for its creation, who confused the consumption of transcendent experiences with the hard work of making such experiences available to others through art. The economic implications of this transformation were equally troubling to Baudelaire, who struggled throughout his life with financial instability and the practical demands of making a living as a writer. The destruction of will that accompanied heavy drug use made it increasingly difficult to meet deadlines, complete projects, or maintain the professional relationships necessary for literary success. The artificial paradises that had once seemed to offer shortcuts to artistic achievement gradually revealed themselves as obstacles to the very productivity that would have allowed him to achieve his artistic and financial goals. Baudelaire's analysis of this conflict was informed by his deep understanding of the relationship between suffering and creativity. He had come to believe that great art emerged from the artist's struggle to transform pain into beauty, to find meaning in suffering, and to create order from chaos. This transformative process required not just sensitivity to experience, but also the strength of will necessary to work with difficult material over extended periods. Drugs like hashish and opium, by offering easy access to transcendent experiences, seemed to short-circuit this essential struggle, providing the rewards of artistic achievement without the personal growth that should accompany such achievement. The philosophical framework that Baudelaire developed to understand this conflict would prove prophetic in its insights into the relationship between consciousness-altering substances and creative productivity. His recognition that different drugs had fundamentally different effects on human agency and willpower anticipated modern research into the neurochemistry of addiction and creativity, while his moral critique of artificial transcendence continues to resonate with contemporary discussions about the role of drugs in artistic and intellectual life. The tragic irony of his own career, that his greatest insights into the nature of artificial paradises came at the cost of his ability to fully realize his artistic potential, serves as a powerful reminder of the complex relationship between experience and expression that lies at the heart of all creative endeavor. The death of Charles Baudelaire on August 31, 1867, at the age of 46, marked not just the end of one of France's most revolutionary poetic careers, but also the tragic culmination of a decades-long struggle between artistic genius and chemical dependency that had begun in the elegant salons of the Club des Hashichins. The man who had once approached consciousness-altering substances with the curiosity of a scientist and the enthusiasm of a young poet seeking new sources of inspiration, died broken in body and spirit, his final years consumed by an opium addiction that had gradually stripped away his capacity for the sustained creative work that had made him one of the most important figures in French literature. His fate served as a sobering reminder that the artificial paradises he had so eloquently described and critiqued could exact a price that even the most brilliant minds were powerless to avoid. Baudelaire's descent into terminal addiction had been gradual and insidious, beginning with what seemed like harmless experimentation among the intellectual elite of Paris and evolving into a dependency that would ultimately consume his health, his finances, and his creative powers. The progression from occasional hashish use at the monthly seances to regular opium consumption reflected not just personal weakness, but also the seductive nature of substances that promised to solve the fundamental problems of human existence while actually exacerbating them. The poet who had written so perceptively about the false nature of artificial paradises found himself increasingly unable to escape their gravitational pull, even as he recognized their destructive power with painful clarity. The irony of Baudelaire's fate was particularly cruel, given his sophisticated understanding of addiction's mechanisms and his repeated attempts to warn others about the dangers he had experienced firsthand. His writings about consciousness-altering substances had evolved from early enthusiasm to mature skepticism, and finally to desperate warnings about the spiritual and creative bankruptcy that accompanied chemical dependency. Yet this intellectual understanding proved powerless against the physiological and psychological forces that drove his continued drug use, demonstrating the tragic gap between knowledge and action that characterizes so many struggles with addiction. The physical deterioration that accompanied Baudelaire's final years was as devastating as it was visible to his contemporaries. The elegant young man who had once graced the salons of Paris with his wit and literary brilliance gradually transformed into a prematurely aged figure whose health had been ravaged by years of opium abuse. His once sharp mind, capable of the most subtle psychological insights and the most precise poetic expression, became increasingly clouded by the very substances he had once hoped would enhance his creative powers. Friends and admirers watched in horror as one of France's greatest literary talents slowly destroyed himself with the same methodical precision he had once brought to his poetry. The financial consequences of Baudelaire's addiction compounded his physical and mental decline, creating a vicious cycle that made recovery increasingly difficult. Opium was an expensive habit that consumed resources he could ill afford, forcing him to take on hack work and commercial writing projects that diverted energy from his serious literary endeavors. The destruction of his will that he had identified as hashish and opium's most dangerous effect made it increasingly difficult to complete projects, meet deadlines, or maintain the professional relationships necessary for literary success. As his reputation for reliability declined, so did his income, forcing him to rely increasingly on loans, advances, and the charity of friends who watched helplessly as he squandered his talents. The creative impact of Baudelaire's addiction was perhaps the most tragic aspect of his decline, as it represented the loss not just of a single individual, but of the literary works that might have emerged from his continued productivity. The poet who had revolutionized French literature with Les Fleurs du Mal and had articulated a new aesthetic philosophy in his critical writings found himself increasingly unable to sustain the focused attention necessary for serious creative work. The artificial paradises that had once seemed to offer unlimited inspiration revealed themselves as creative dead ends that consumed more energy than they provided, leaving Baudelaire with the memory of transcendent experiences, but without the capacity to transform those experiences into lasting art. The social isolation that accompanied Baudelaire's final years reflected both the stigma associated with drug addiction and the practical difficulties of maintaining relationships while struggling with dependency. Former friends and colleagues, initially sympathetic to his struggles, gradually distanced themselves as his behavior became increasingly erratic and his demands for financial assistance more frequent. The literary salons and intellectual circles that had once welcomed his participation became less accessible as his reputation for reliability declined and his physical appearance deteriorated. This isolation further accelerated his decline, removing the social supports that might have helped him maintain some connection to the productive literary life he had once enjoyed. The medical understanding of addiction available during Baudelaire's lifetime was primitive by modern standards, offering little hope for effective treatment or recovery. Physicians of the 1860s viewed opium addiction primarily as a moral failing rather than a medical condition, providing treatments that were often more harmful than helpful and offering little in the way of psychological support or understanding. Baudelaire's own attempts at self-treatment, informed by his sophisticated understanding of the addiction process, proved no more successful than the conventional medical approaches of his time, demonstrating the limitations of even the most insightful self-analysis when confronted with the physiological realities of chemical dependency. The literary legacy that Baudelaire left behind was profoundly shaped by his experiences with consciousness-altering substances, both positive and negative. His early experiments with hashish had contributed to the development of his unique poetic voice and his revolutionary aesthetic philosophy, while his later struggles with opium addiction had provided him with insights into human suffering and spiritual emptiness that informed some of his greatest works. The tension between artificial and authentic experience that characterized his mature writings emerged directly from his personal struggle with the seductive appeal of chemical transcendence, making his addiction an integral part of his artistic development, even as it ultimately destroyed his capacity for continued creativity. The broader cultural impact of Baudelaire's tragic fate extended far beyond his personal circumstances, serving as a cautionary tale that influenced attitudes toward consciousness-altering substances for generations to come. His death provided concrete evidence for critics who had argued that drug experimentation was inherently dangerous and socially destructive, while simultaneously robbing advocates of consciousness exploration of one of their most articulate and sophisticated spokesmen. The loss of Baudelaire represented not just a personal tragedy, but a cultural catastrophe that deprived French literature of one of its most innovative voices at the height of his potential influence. The circumstances of Baudelaire's death, alone, impoverished, and largely forgotten by the literary establishment that had once celebrated his genius, served as a stark reminder of the ultimate futility of seeking transcendence through chemical means. The poet who had once written so eloquently about the beautiful yet false worlds created by artificial paradises had become their final victim, his life serving as the most powerful possible illustration of his own warnings about the destructive nature of drug-induced transcendence. His fate would echo through the decades that followed, influencing both scientific understanding of addiction and cultural attitudes toward the relationship between consciousness-altering substances and creative achievement. The gradual exodus of the Club des Hachishins' most distinguished members represented more than simple disillusionment with drug experimentation. It marked a profound philosophical awakening about the nature of authentic creativity and the relationship between artificial stimulation and genuine artistic achievement. As the initial excitement of consciousness exploration gave way to sober reflection on its long-term consequences, the literary giants who had once gathered monthly at the Hôtel P. Modin began to recognize that their pursuit of chemically induced inspiration was fundamentally at odds with their deepest commitments as artists and intellectuals. The departure of figures like Théophile Gautier and Charles Baudelaire from the club's activities signaled not just personal decisions, but a broader cultural shift in understanding the sources and requirements of authentic creative work. Théophile Gautier's withdrawal from the hashish experiments was perhaps the most philosophically significant, given his role as the club's primary chronicler and one of its most enthusiastic early participants. His famous declaration that the true writer needs only his natural dreams, and he does not like his thought to be influenced by any agent, represented a fundamental revaluation of the relationship between external stimulation and internal creativity that would influence literary theory for generations to come. This statement emerged from years of careful observation and personal experience that had gradually convinced him that artificial enhancement of consciousness, no matter how spectacular its immediate effects, ultimately represented a form of creative dependency that weakened rather than strengthened the artist's natural faculties. Gautier's evolution from enthusiastic participant to philosophical critic reflected his growing understanding that the hashish experiences, while undeniably powerful and often beautiful, were fundamentally passive in nature. Under the drug's influence, he had experienced extraordinary visions and insights that seemed to reveal hidden dimensions of reality, but he had gradually come to recognize that these experiences were essentially receptive rather than creative. The hashish provided raw material for consciousness, but did not enhance the artist's capacity to transform that material into lasting works of art. Indeed, Gautier began to suspect that regular reliance on artificial stimulation might actually atrophy the natural creative faculties by providing easy access to transcendent experiences that should properly emerge from the artist's own imaginative powers. The concept of natural dreams that Gautier invoked in his explanation for leaving the club represented more than mere preference for unaltered consciousness. It articulated a sophisticated theory about the sources of authentic artistic inspiration. Natural dreams, in Gautier's understanding, emerged from the artist's own psychological depths and reflected their unique personality, experiences, and creative vision in ways that artificially induced visions could never match. The dreams that came naturally to the artist were already filtered through their individual sensibility and artistic training, making them immediately available for creative transformation in ways that drug-induced experiences were not. Gautier's concern about having his thoughts influenced by any agent reflected a deeper anxiety about artistic autonomy and creative authenticity that was becoming increasingly important to the Romantic generation of writers. The idea that external substances could fundamentally alter the artist's consciousness raised troubling questions about the ownership and authenticity of any insights or creative works that emerged from such altered states. If a poem was written under the influence of hashish, Gautier wondered, could it truly be considered the product of the poet's own imagination? Or was it rather a collaboration between human consciousness and chemical agent that compromised the work's artistic integrity? This philosophical concern was reinforced by practical observations about the long-term effects of regular hashish use on creative productivity. Gautier had noticed that his most frequent periods of drug experimentation coincided with decreased output of original writing, as if the artificial stimulation was somehow displacing rather than enhancing his natural creative processes. The time and energy devoted to the monthly seances combined with the recovery periods that followed intense hashish experiences represented a significant diversion from the sustained daily work that Gautier had come to recognize as essential to serious literary achievement. Charles Baudelaire's departure from the club followed a different trajectory, but arrived at similar conclusions about the incompatibility between artificial stimulation and authentic creativity. His withdrawal was more gradual and conflicted than Gautier's, reflecting his deeper personal involvement with consciousness-altering substances and his more complex relationship with the questions they raised about the nature of artistic inspiration. Baudelaire's eventual recognition that hashish and opium destroyed the will represented a hard-won insight into the fundamental requirements of creative work that had cost him dearly in terms of both personal suffering and lost productivity. The process by which Baudelaire came to understand the destructive nature of artificial paradises was particularly painful, because it required him to acknowledge that substances he had once viewed as creative allies were actually obstacles to the artistic achievement he most desired. His early experiences with hashish had seemed to offer access to exactly the kind of transcendent insights that great poetry should express. But his attempts to capture these insights in writing had repeatedly failed. The drug-induced visions were too ephemeral, too dependent on altered consciousness to survive translation into the sustained creative work that poetry required. Baudelaire's growing awareness of this creative paradox was compounded by his observation of the drug's effects on his fellow club members. He watched as some of the most talented writers of his generation became increasingly dependent on artificial stimulation for their sense of creative vitality, while their actual literary output declined in both quantity and quality. The club that had been founded to explore the relationship between consciousness alteration and artistic achievement was gradually revealing that relationship to be fundamentally antagonistic rather than complementary. The broader philosophical implications of these individual departures reflected changing attitudes toward the nature of artistic inspiration that were emerging throughout European intellectual culture. The romantic emphasis on individual genius and authentic personal expression was increasingly at odds with the idea that creativity could be enhanced through external agents that fundamentally altered the artist's consciousness. The notion that great art should emerge from the artist's own depths rather than from chemically induced states was becoming a central tenet of artistic integrity that made continued participation in drug experimentation seem like a betrayal of creative principles. The practical considerations that influenced these departures were equally important, as the literary members of the club began to recognize the opportunity costs associated with their consciousness exploration. The time devoted to monthly hashish sessions combined with the recovery periods and the general disruption to regular work schedules represented a significant diversion from the sustained creative effort that serious literary achievement required. As these writers matured and their professional responsibilities increased, the luxury of experimental consciousness exploration became increasingly difficult to justify. The social and professional risks associated with continued participation in drug experimentation also played a role in the literary exodus from the club. As public awareness of the group's activities increased and social attitudes toward drug use became more critical, continued association with hashish experimentation posed potential threats to the members' reputations and careers. Writers who depended on public approval and commercial success could ill afford to be associated with activities that might be viewed as scandalous or morally questionable. The departure of the club's most distinguished literary members marked the end of an era in the relationship between consciousness-altering substances and artistic creativity. Their collective recognition that artificial stimulation was ultimately incompatible with authentic creative work would influence attitudes toward drugs and creativity for generations to come, establishing a philosophical framework that continues to shape debates about the role of consciousness alteration in artistic achievement. The wisdom they gained through their experiments, that true creativity must emerge from the artist's own natural faculties rather than from external enhancement, represented perhaps the most valuable insight to emerge from the Club des Hashichins' brief but influential existence. The perfection of the hypodermic needle in the 1850s represented one of those pivotal moments in medical history when a seemingly simple technological innovation fundamentally transformed not just therapeutic practice, but the entire landscape of human consciousness and addiction. Dr. Charles Gabriel Prevas, working in his Lyon clinic, could hardly have imagined that his refinements to the crude injection devices of earlier decades would unleash a revolution that would make morphine addiction one of the defining social problems of the late 19th century. His elegant glass syringe, with its precisely calibrated measurements and sharp steel needle, transformed morphine from a relatively manageable oral medication into a delivery system of unprecedented power and danger, creating what amounted to an entirely new category of human experience and dependency. The technological challenges that Pravaz overcame in perfecting his hypodermic apparatus were formidable, requiring innovations in glass-blowing, metalworking, and precision engineering that pushed the boundaries of mid-19th century manufacturing capabilities. Earlier attempts at subcutaneous injection had relied on crude devices that were painful to use, difficult to sterilize, and unreliable in their dosing mechanisms. These primitive instruments, often little more than sharpened tubes attached to leather bladders or simple pistons, had limited the technique to emergency medical situations, where the benefits clearly outweighed the considerable risks and discomfort involved. Pravaz's breakthrough lay in his recognition that successful subcutaneous injection required not just a sharp needle, but an entire system of precisely engineered components working in perfect harmony. His glass syringe barrel was graduated with minute markings that allowed physicians to measure doses with unprecedented accuracy, while the plunger mechanism was designed to provide smooth, controlled pressure that could deliver medication at exactly the right rate. The needle itself represented a marvel of metallurgical precision, sharp enough to penetrate skin with minimal trauma, yet strong enough to maintain its point through repeated use, and hollow enough to allow the free flow of viscous. The medical applications of Pravaz's device initially focused on legitimate therapeutic uses that seemed to justify the risks associated with this new delivery method. Physicians found that subcutaneous injection could provide rapid pain relief for patients suffering from conditions that made oral medication impractical or ineffective. Surgical patients who couldn't swallow, individuals with severe gastrointestinal disorders, or those experiencing pain so intense that the delayed onset of oral morphine was inadequate. The ability to deliver precise doses directly into the bloodstream represented a quantum leap in medical precision that promised to revolutionize the treatment of pain and suffering. However, the pharmacological implications of subcutaneous morphine injection extended far beyond improved medical care, creating effects that were qualitatively different from anything achievable through oral administration. When morphine was injected directly under the skin, it bypassed the digestive system entirely, entering the bloodstream and reaching the brain within minutes, rather than the hour or more required for oral doses to take effect. This rapid onset created what users quickly learned to recognize as after rush, an intense wave of euphoria and well-being that was far more powerful and immediate than anything produced by traditional opium preparations. The psychological impact of this rapid delivery system proved to be as significant as its pharmacological effects. The immediate gratification provided by hypodermic injection created a powerful conditioning mechanism that made morphine addiction far more likely and more severe than addiction to oral opiates. Users learned to associate the physical act of injection with immediate relief from both physical and psychological distress, creating behavioral patterns that were extraordinarily difficult to break. The ritual aspects of injection, preparing the syringe, finding a vein, experiencing the rush, became as addictive as the drug itself, establishing psychological dependencies that persisted long after physical withdrawal symptoms had subsided. The precision dosing capabilities of Pravaz's syringe also contributed to morphine's addictive potential by allowing users to titrate their doses with scientific accuracy. Unlike crude oral preparations where dosing was necessarily approximate, the graduated markings on hypodermic syringes enabled users to experiment systematically with different amounts, gradually increasing their doses as tolerance developed. This precision paradoxically made the drug more dangerous by facilitating the kind of methodical dose escalation that characterized severe addiction, while creating an illusion of scientific control that masked the progressive loss of self-control that addiction represented. The social implications of the hypodermic revolution became apparent almost immediately as the technology spread throughout the medical community and beyond. Physicians who had initially embraced subcutaneous injection as a breakthrough in pain management began to notice alarming patterns of dependency among their patients, particularly those who had been treated for chronic conditions requiring repeated morphine administration. The same precision and effectiveness that made hypodermic injection so valuable therapeutically also made it extraordinarily seductive to individuals seeking escape from psychological distress or simply pursuing novel forms of consciousness alteration. The democratization of injection technology represented another crucial factor in morphine's spread throughout society. Pravaz's design was elegant enough to be manufactured commercially and simple enough to be used by individuals without extensive medical training. Pharmacies began selling hypodermic kits to physicians and eventually to private individuals, creating a distribution network that made subcutaneous morphine injection accessible to anyone with sufficient money and motivation. The transformation of a sophisticated medical procedure into a consumer product removed many of the barriers that had previously limited access to powerful consciousness-altering substances. The cultural impact of hypodermic injection extended beyond its practical effects to influence fundamental attitudes toward medicine, technology, and human enhancement. The ability to deliver powerful drugs directly into the bloodstream seemed to represent the triumph of scientific precision over the crude approximations of traditional medicine, embodying the 19th century's faith in technological solutions to human problems. The hypodermic syringe became a symbol of medical modernity, its gleaming glass and steel construction suggesting a future where human suffering could be eliminated through the precise application of scientific knowledge. Yet this technological optimism was quickly tempered by growing awareness of the darker implications of such powerful delivery systems. The same precision that made hypodermic injection so effective therapeutically also made it extraordinarily dangerous when used inappropriately, creating dependencies that were more severe and more difficult to treat than anything previously encountered in medical practice. The technology that had promised to eliminate suffering was creating new forms of suffering that proved even more intractable than the conditions it was designed to treat. The manufacturing and distribution of hypodermic equipment became a significant industry in its own right, with companies competing to produce ever more elegant and user-friendly injection devices. Luxury versions appeared featuring gold-plated needles, jeweled cases, and artistic decorations that transformed medical instruments into fashionable accessories. These ornate syringes reflected the social status that morphine use had acquired among certain segments of society, while their beauty and craftsmanship helped normalize injection as a sophisticated rather than degraded activity. The international spread of hypodermic technology ensured that the morphine epidemic would not be confined to France, but would become a global phenomenon affecting every developed nation. Medical journals carried detailed descriptions of Pravaz's innovations, while medical supply companies established international distribution networks that made hypodermic equipment available worldwide. The technology that had emerged from one physician's desire to improve patient care became the foundation for a transformation in global patterns of drug use and addiction that would persist well into the 20th century. The legacy of Pravaz's hypodermic revolution extends far beyond its immediate impact on 19th century morphine use, establishing technological and cultural precedents that continue to influence contemporary approaches to drug delivery and addiction treatment. The precision, immediacy, and power of subcutaneous injection set new standards for pharmaceutical effectiveness while simultaneously creating new categories of risk and dependency that medical science is still struggling to understand and address. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 marked a watershed moment in the history of morphine use in France, transforming what had been a relatively contained medical phenomenon into a social epidemic of staggering proportions. The conflict's brutal toll, over 150,000 French casualties, the siege of Paris, and the traumatic birth of the German Empire on French soil, created conditions that would accelerate morphine consumption beyond anything previously imagined. The statistics from Paris's centralized pharmacy system tell a story of exponential growth that defies easy explanation through medical necessity alone. From just over a quarter of a kilogram in 1855 to more than 10 kilograms in 1875, and finally to an almost incomprehensible 750 kilograms by the 1890s, a 3,000-fold increase that represented one of the most dramatic drug epidemics in recorded history. The immediate aftermath of the war created unprecedented demand for morphine's pain-relieving properties. As French military hospitals struggled to treat thousands of wounded soldiers whose injuries required aggressive pain management, the hypodermic needle, perfected by Charles Prévaz just 2 decades earlier, proved its worth on the battlefields and in the makeshift hospitals of besieged Paris, where physicians discovered that subcutaneous morphine injection could provide rapid relief for traumatic injuries that would have been unbearable under previous treatment regimens. Military surgeons, working under desperate conditions with limited supplies and overwhelming numbers of casualties, came to rely on morphine as their primary tool for managing pain during amputations, wound cleaning, and other procedures that would have been impossible without effective anesthesia. However, the war's impact on morphine consumption extended far beyond the immediate medical needs of wounded soldiers. The psychological trauma experienced by both combatants and civilians created a vast population of individuals seeking relief from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety, conditions for which 19th-century medicine offered few effective treatments beyond morphine's temporary respite. Veterans returning from the front carried with them not just physical wounds, but psychological scars that made civilian life seem unbearable, leading many to seek in morphine the same relief from mental anguish that it had provided from physical pain during their military service. The siege of Paris, which lasted from September 1870 to January 1871, created particularly intense conditions that accelerated morphine use among the civilian population. As Prussian forces surrounded the capital, cutting off food supplies and subjecting the city to constant bombardment, Parisians experienced levels of stress, hunger, and fear that pushed many toward any available form of psychological relief. Morphine, already established in medical practice and increasingly available through commercial channels, offered temporary escape from the horrors of siege warfare and the constant threat of death or starvation. The drug's ability to induce feelings of well-being and detachment from immediate circumstances made it particularly appealing to individuals trapped in seemingly hopeless situations. The economic disruption caused by the war and its aftermath created additional pressures that contributed to increased morphine consumption. The German indemnity of 5 billion francs imposed as part of the peace settlement created enormous financial strain on French society, leading to widespread unemployment, business failures, and social instability. Many individuals who had lost their livelihoods or seen their life savings wiped out by the war's economic consequences turned to morphine as a way of coping with financial desperation and social displacement. The drug offered temporary relief from the anxiety and depression that accompanied economic ruin, creating a cycle of dependency that was difficult to break even when financial circumstances improved. The transformation of French medical practice during and after the war also contributed significantly to the explosion in morphine consumption. Military physicians who had become accustomed to using morphine liberally during wartime continued these practices in civilian medicine, prescribing the drug for conditions that would previously have been treated with less powerful medications or non-pharmaceutical interventions. The war had demonstrated morphine's effectiveness so dramatically that many physicians came to view it as a universal remedy for both physical and psychological suffering, leading to prescription practices that would be considered reckless by modern standards. The social disruption caused by the war created additional pathways for morphine's spread throughout French society. Traditional social structures and moral constraints had been weakened by the trauma of defeat and occupation, creating an environment where experimental behavior and risk-taking became more acceptable. The breakdown of normal social supervision, combined with the widespread availability of morphine through medical and commercial channels, removed many of the barriers that had previously limited access to consciousness-altering substances. Young people in particular found themselves in a social environment where morphine use was increasingly normalized and where traditional authorities were less capable of enforcing conventional moral standards. The demographic impact of the war also played a crucial role in shaping patterns of morphine consumption. The conflict had killed or disabled many young men who would normally have been entering their most productive years, creating a generation of widows, orphans, and disabled veterans who faced uncertain futures with limited social support. These vulnerable populations proved particularly susceptible to morphine's appeal, as the drug offered temporary relief from grief, anxiety, and the practical challenges of rebuilding their lives in a devastated society. The absence of traditional family structures and community support systems left many individuals without the social resources that might have helped them cope with trauma through healthier means. The technological and industrial changes accelerated by the war effort also contributed to morphine's proliferation. The conflict had demonstrated the importance of efficient pharmaceutical production and distribution, leading to investments in manufacturing capacity that made morphine more widely available and affordable than ever before. French pharmaceutical companies, seeking to rebuild their businesses after the war's disruptions, found in morphine a product with seemingly unlimited demand and substantial profit margins. The expansion of production capacity, combined with improvements in distribution networks, ensured that morphine would be readily available to meet the growing demand from both medical and non-medical users. The cultural impact of France's humiliating defeat created psychological conditions that made morphine's appeal particularly powerful. The loss of Alsace-Lorraine, the payment of massive indemnities, and the occupation of French territory by German forces had shattered French confidence in their national destiny and cultural superiority. Many French citizens found themselves questioning fundamental assumptions about progress, civilization, and their country's place in the world, creating an existential crisis that made morphine's promise of temporary escape from painful reality particularly seductive. The drug offered relief not just from individual suffering, but from the collective trauma of national defeat and humiliation. The statistical progression from a quarter kilogram in 1855 to 750 kilograms by the 1890s represents more than mere numerical growth. It documents the transformation of French society's relationship with consciousness-altering substances. The exponential nature of this increase suggests that morphine consumption had moved beyond medical necessity to become a self-reinforcing social phenomenon, where each new user potentially influenced others to experiment with the drug. The centralized pharmacy data, while representing only official medical distribution, likely understates the true extent of morphine use, as it doesn't account for black market distribution, international smuggling, or the growing number of individuals who obtained the drug through non-medical channels. By the 1890s, morphine had become so deeply embedded in French society that its use was no longer confined to any particular social class or demographic group. The drug had spread from military hospitals to civilian medical practice, from medical necessity to recreational use, and from individual experimentation to widespread social acceptance. The post-war surge that began in the 1870s had created a morphine epidemic that would define French social problems for the remainder of the 19th century and establish patterns of drug use and addiction that would persist well into the modern era. By the dawn of the 20th century, Paris had transformed from the city of light into what contemporary observers increasingly described as a metropolis, drowning in a sea of artificial intoxication. The anonymous novelist's shocking declaration that in Paris alone there are more than 300,000 scum who shoot up morphine, drink ether, swallow hashish, smoke opium, captured not just the staggering numerical scope of the addiction crisis, but also the profound social anxiety and moral panic that had gripped French society as it confronted the reality of mass drug dependency. This figure, representing nearly 1 in every 8 Parisians, suggested that substance abuse had moved far beyond the margins of society to become a defining characteristic of urban life itself, touching every neighborhood, every social class, and every aspect of the capital's cultural and economic existence. The scale implied by this estimate was almost incomprehensible to contemporary observers who had witnessed the gradual evolution of drug use from the exclusive experiments of literary salons to the widespread social phenomenon it had become by century's end. 300,000 addicts in a city of approximately 2.7 million inhabitants meant that drug dependency had achieved a prevalence that dwarfed other major social problems of the era, including alcoholism, prostitution, and poverty. The sheer magnitude of these numbers suggested that Paris was experiencing something unprecedented in human history, the first modern drug epidemic, where industrial-scale pharmaceutical production had combined with urban social conditions to create patterns of substance abuse that exceeded anything previously documented in medical or social literature. The novelist's use of the derogatory term scum reflected the complex mixture of fear, disgust, and social anxiety that characterized middle-class attitudes toward the addiction epidemic. This language revealed how drug dependency had become associated not just with individual moral failing, but with broader concerns about social degeneration and national decline that haunted French consciousness in the aftermath of military defeat and rapid social change. The lumping together of users of different substances, morphine, ether, hashish, and opium, suggested that contemporary observers viewed all forms of consciousness alteration as part of a single, undifferentiated threat to social order and moral stability. The diversity of substances mentioned in this account highlighted the sophisticated drug culture that had developed in fin de siècle Paris, where users had access to an unprecedented variety of consciousness-altering chemicals and had developed elaborate hierarchies of preference and social meaning around different forms of intoxication. Morphine injection represented the pinnacle of pharmaceutical sophistication, requiring expensive equipment and technical knowledge that marked users as members of the educated classes. Ether drinking, while less prestigious, offered similar effects at lower cost and with greater availability, making it popular among working-class users who couldn't afford morphine's luxury. Hashish consumption connected users to the exotic traditions of the Orient that had fascinated French intellectuals since the days of the Club des Hachishans, while opium smoking evoked the mysterious allure of Far Eastern culture that had captured Parisian imagination. The geographical concentration of this epidemic in Paris reflected the unique conditions that made the capital particularly vulnerable to mass drug addiction. As the political, cultural, and economic center of France, Paris attracted individuals from across the country and around the world, creating a cosmopolitan environment where traditional social controls were weakened and experimental behavior was more likely to be tolerated or even celebrated. The city's role as a center of pharmaceutical manufacturing and distribution ensured ready access to pure, potent drugs, while its sophisticated medical establishment provided both legitimate and illegitimate pathways for obtaining controlled substances. The social infrastructure of Paris also facilitated the spread of drug culture in ways that would have been impossible in smaller, more traditional communities. The city's network of cafés, cabarets, and private salons provided venues where drug use could be practiced and normalized, while its large population of artists, writers, and intellectuals created cultural justifications for consciousness exploration that helped legitimize substance abuse among educated classes. The anonymity possible in a large urban environment allowed individuals to experiment with drugs without the social consequences that might have deterred such behavior in smaller communities where everyone knew everyone else. The economic dimensions of this epidemic were staggering, representing a massive transfer of wealth from productive activities to the pharmaceutical and black market drug trade. 300,000 regular drug users, each spending substantial portions of their income on substances that provided no lasting value, represented a significant drain on the Parisian economy that affected everything from family finances to commercial activity. The novelist's estimate suggested that drug addiction had become a major economic force in its own right, supporting not just pharmaceutical companies but also a vast underground economy of dealers, suppliers, and service providers who catered to the needs of dependent users. The medical implications of such widespread drug use overwhelmed the capacity of French healthcare institutions to provide effective treatment or even basic care for addicted individuals. The medical understanding of addiction available at the turn of the century was primitive by modern standards, offering little hope for recovery and often treating dependency as a moral rather than medical problem. Hospitals and asylums found themselves dealing with unprecedented numbers of patients suffering from drug-related health problems, while physicians struggled to develop effective treatments for conditions they barely understood. The demographic breakdown of this epidemic revealed how drug addiction had spread across traditional social boundaries to affect virtually every segment of Parisian society. While the original drug experiments had been concentrated among the intellectual and artistic elite, the epidemic of the 1890s included working-class laborers seeking relief from industrial drudgery, middle-class professionals coping with urban stress, wealthy socialites pursuing fashionable diversions, and marginalized populations using drugs to escape poverty and social exclusion. This broad social distribution meant that drug addiction could no longer be dismissed as a problem affecting only society's margins. It had become a mainstream phenomenon that touched families and communities across the social spectrum. The cultural impact of such widespread drug use was equally profound, influencing everything from literature and art to fashion and social customs. The normalization of consciousness alteration had created new forms of social interaction and cultural expression, while simultaneously undermining traditional values and institutions that had previously provided structure and meaning to urban life. The novelist's shock tone suggested that many observers viewed this cultural transformation as fundamentally threatening to the foundations of civilized society. The international implications of Paris's drug epidemic extended far beyond France's borders, as the capital's reputation as a center of cultural innovation meant that its social problems were likely to spread to other major cities around the world. Foreign visitors to Paris encountered drug culture as part of the city's exotic appeal, potentially carrying both substances and practices back to their home countries. The global influence of French culture ensured that the addiction patterns developing in Paris would serve as models for similar epidemics in other urban centers. The novelist's estimate of 300,000 addicts, while possibly exaggerated for dramatic effect, captured the essential reality that drug addiction had achieved epidemic proportions in turn-of-the-century Paris. Whether the actual number was 200,000 or 400,000 mattered less than the undeniable fact that substance abuse had become a mass phenomenon that defined the character of urban life and posed unprecedented challenges to social order, public health, and cultural continuity. This epidemic would serve as a harbinger of similar crises that would affect cities around the world as industrial society grappled with the unintended consequences of its own technological and pharmaceutical innovations. In the glittering salons and opulent drawing rooms of fin de siècle Paris, a peculiar transformation was taking place that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. Morphine addiction was becoming not just socially acceptable among the upper classes, but positively fashionable, elevated to the status of what contemporary satirists mockingly termed the narcotic à la mode, or a sin of luxe. This remarkable social phenomenon represented more than mere decadence. It reflected the complex ways in which technological innovation, cultural anxiety, and class distinction combined to transform a medical treatment into a luxury commodity that served as both escape from and symbol of elite status. The morphine habit had evolved from a shameful secret into a sophisticated accessory of refined living, complete with its own elaborate rituals, specialized equipment, and social hierarchies that rivaled those surrounding any other aristocratic pursuit. The transformation of morphine injection from medical procedure to fashionable practice required a fundamental reimagining of the hypodermic syringe itself, which evolved from a purely functional medical instrument into an object of extraordinary beauty and craftsmanship that reflected the aesthetic sensibilities and social pretensions of its wealthy users. The elegant hypodermic needles that became fashionable among the Parisian elite were marvels of decorative art as much as pharmaceutical technology, featuring gold-plated barrels engraved with intricate patterns, silver needles that gleamed like jewelry, and glass chambers so perfectly clear and precisely graduated that they resembled the finest crystal. These instruments were commissioned from the same artisans who created luxury watches, jewelry, and other precious objects, ensuring that every aspect of their design reflected the refined taste and unlimited resources of their owners. The bejeweled velvet-lined cases that housed these precious syringes represented perhaps the most striking symbol of morphine's transformation into a luxury commodity. These cases, often crafted by the same firms that supplied jewelry boxes to European royalty, featured rich fabrics in deep purples and midnight blues, lined with silk and fitted with custom-molded compartments that held each component of the injection apparatus with the precision of a fine watch case. The exteriors were frequently decorated with precious stones, gold inlays, and elaborate monograms that proclaimed their owners' wealth and status, while hidden compartments contained supplies of pure morphine in crystal vials that sparkled like diamonds in the gaslight of elegant drawing rooms. The social rituals that developed around elite morphine use were as elaborate and codified as those surrounding any other aristocratic pursuit, creating a parallel culture of refinement and sophistication that transformed drug injection into a form of performance art. The preparation of the syringe became a ceremony in itself, with users displaying their technical skill and aesthetic sensibility through the graceful manipulation of their expensive equipment. The selection of injection sites was guided not just by medical considerations, but by aesthetic ones, with users choosing locations that would minimize visible marks while maximizing the dramatic effect of the injection process itself. The timing and social context of morphine use among the elite reflected careful attention to the drug's effects on social interaction and personal presentation. Unlike the crude intoxication associated with alcohol or the unpredictable effects of hashish, morphine provided a controlled enhancement of mood and perception that could be precisely calibrated to enhance rather than disrupt sophisticated social gatherings. Users learned to time their injections to coincide with dinner parties, salon conversations, or cultural events where the drug's euphoric effects would heighten their appreciation of art, music, and intellectual discourse without compromising their ability to participate effectively in elite social life. The medical legitimacy that surrounded morphine use provided crucial cover for its adoption by respectable society, allowing wealthy users to frame their addiction as sophisticated medical treatment rather than crude recreational drug use. The involvement of fashionable physicians in prescribing and administering morphine to elite patients created an aura of scientific respectability that distinguished morphine addiction from other forms of substance abuse associated with lower social classes. These doctors, often as addicted as their patients, developed elaborate theoretical justifications for regular morphine use that drew on the latest medical theories about nervous disorders, neurasthenia, and the special health needs of highly refined individuals. The gendered dimensions of elite morphine culture reflected broader social anxieties about women's roles and capabilities in rapidly changing urban society. While men's morphine use was often justified in terms of professional stress or war-related trauma, women's addiction was frequently attributed to the supposed delicacy of the female nervous system and the particular pressures of maintaining social position in competitive aristocratic circles. The image of the elegant morphinomane, reclining on silk cushions with her jeweled syringe, became a powerful symbol of both feminine sophistication and feminine vulnerability that captured contemporary anxieties about women's increasing independence and social visibility. The economic dimensions of elite morphine culture were staggering, representing a luxury market that rivaled those for fine art, jewelry, or haute couture in terms of both individual expenditure and aggregate social impact. A single bejeweled syringe case could cost more than a working-class family's annual income, while the pure morphine required to maintain a serious habit represented a continuous drain on even substantial fortunes. The pharmaceutical companies that supplied this market developed specialized product lines that catered specifically to wealthy users, offering morphine of exceptional purity and consistency that commanded premium prices and was marketed with the same attention to branding and presentation that characterized other luxury goods. The international character of elite morphine culture reflected the cosmopolitan nature of European high society, with fashionable addiction practices spreading rapidly between Paris, London, Vienna, and other major capitals through the networks of travel and social connection that linked aristocratic families across national boundaries. Wealthy Americans visiting Europe encountered morphine culture as part of the sophisticated European lifestyle they sought to emulate, carrying both practices and equipment back to New York and other American cities, where they established similar patterns of fashionable addiction among the social elite. The artistic and literary dimensions of elite morphine culture provided additional layers of sophistication and cultural legitimacy that distinguished it from crude recreational drug use. Writers, artists, and musicians who moved in aristocratic circles often incorporated morphine use into their creative practices, claiming that the drug enhanced their aesthetic sensibilities and provided access to refined states of consciousness that informed their work. The association between morphine and artistic creativity, inherited from the earlier experiments of the Club des Hachichens, provided intellectual justification for what might otherwise have been dismissed as mere hedonistic indulgence. The decline of elite morphine culture at the turn of the century reflected changing social attitudes toward both drug use and aristocratic privilege that would reshape European society in the coming decades. The growing awareness of morphine's destructive potential, combined with rising democratic sentiment that questioned the moral authority of traditional elites, gradually undermined the social acceptability of fashionable addiction. The sin of luxe. that had once seemed the height of sophisticated refinement increasingly appeared as a symbol of aristocratic decadence and moral bankruptcy that had no place in the modern world. The legacy of elite morphine culture extended far beyond its immediate historical moment, establishing patterns of luxury, drug consumption, and social justification that would influence attitudes toward consciousness, altering substances throughout the 20th century and beyond. The transformation of medical treatment into fashionable accessory, the development of elaborate consumption rituals, and the creation of luxury markets around addictive substances would all reappear in various forms as new drugs, and new social contexts created fresh opportunities for the intersection of intoxication and social distinction. The catastrophic defeat of France in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 created more than military humiliation and territorial loss. It triggered a profound crisis of national confidence that would fundamentally reshape how French intellectuals, physicians, and social commentators understood the relationship between individual behavior and collective destiny. The explosion of drug abuse that followed in the war's aftermath was not merely coincidental timing, but became inextricably linked in the French imagination to the broader question of national decline, giving birth to a comprehensive theory of degeneration that would dominate social and medical thinking for the remainder of the 19th century. This theory, which connected personal vice to national weakness with scientific precision, transformed drug addiction from an individual medical problem into a symptom of civilizational collapse that threatened the very survival of the French Republic. The intellectual foundations of degeneration theory emerged from the intersection of emerging scientific disciplines, particularly psychiatry, anthropology, and evolutionary biology, with the urgent need to explain France's shocking military defeat by a nation that many French intellectuals had previously considered culturally inferior. The theory's most influential proponent, Dr. Benedict Morel, had already begun developing his ideas about hereditary mental illness and social decay before the war, but the national trauma of 1870-71 provided a compelling real-world laboratory for testing his hypotheses about the relationship between individual pathology and collective decline. Morel and his followers argued that France's defeat was not merely the result of military miscalculation or diplomatic failure, but reflected a deeper process of biological and moral deterioration that had been weakening French society for generations. The timing of the morphine epidemic's emergence in the immediate aftermath of France's defeat provided degeneration theorists with what seemed like perfect evidence for their claims about the relationship between national weakness and individual vice. The same period that witnessed France's military humiliation also saw the explosive growth in drug consumption that would transform Paris into the addiction capital of Europe, creating an apparent causal relationship that seemed to confirm the theory's basic premises. If France had lost the war because its population had become physically and morally weakened by generations of urban decadence and pleasure-seeking, then the post-war explosion of drug abuse represented both a consequence of that weakness and a further acceleration of the degenerative process. The scientific language that degeneration theorists employed to describe this process drew heavily on contemporary understanding of heredity and evolution, creating a framework that seemed to explain both individual addiction and national decline through the same biological mechanisms. According to this theory, the stresses of modern urban life, combined with the moral corruption that accompanied industrial civilization, created hereditary weaknesses that were passed down through generations, gradually undermining the physical and mental vigor that had once made France a dominant European power. Drug addiction was understood not as a personal choice or even a medical condition, but as a manifestation of inherited degenerative tendencies that reflected the accumulated damage of decades of civilizational decline. The geographical concentration of drug abuse in Paris provided additional support for degeneration theory's claims about the relationship between urban civilization and biological decay. Theorists argued that the artificial environment of the modern city, with its pollution, overcrowding, and separation from natural rhythms, created conditions that accelerated the degenerative process and made urban populations particularly vulnerable to various forms of pathology, including drug addiction. The contrast between the supposedly healthy rural populations that had traditionally provided France's military strength and the diseased urban masses that increasingly dominated national life seemed to explain both the country's military weakness and its growing social problems. The class dimensions of degeneration theory reflected broader anxieties about social change and democratic governance that had been intensified by France's military defeat and the traumatic experience of the Paris Commune. Many conservative intellectuals argued that the expansion of political participation and the weakening of traditional hierarchies had allowed degenerative influences to spread throughout society, undermining the natural leadership of healthy elites and giving political power to populations that were biologically unfit for self-governance. The fact that drug addiction had spread from the working classes to the aristocracy seemed to confirm fears that degenerative influences were contaminating even the highest levels of society. The international dimensions of degeneration theory provided a framework for understanding France's changing position in European politics and culture. Theorists argued that other nations, particularly Germany, had maintained their biological vigor through different social and cultural practices, giving them decisive advantages in military and economic competition. The German victory was thus explained not merely in terms of superior organization or technology, but as the natural result of a healthier population defeating a degenerate one. This analysis suggested that France's recovery would require not just military reform or political change, but a fundamental regeneration of the national character through the elimination of degenerative influences. The medical establishment's embrace of degeneration theory provided scientific legitimacy for what might otherwise have been dismissed as political speculation or moral panic. Leading physicians and psychiatrists incorporated degenerative concepts into their understanding of mental illness, addiction, and other pathological conditions, creating a comprehensive medical framework that seemed to explain individual suffering in terms of broader social and biological processes. This medical authority was crucial in establishing degeneration theory's influence over public policy and social attitudes, as it transformed political and moral arguments into apparently objective scientific conclusions. The gender dimensions of degeneration theory reflected contemporary anxieties about changing women's roles and their impact on national strength and social stability. Theorists argued that the increasing independence and visibility of women in urban society represented a departure from natural gender roles that contributed to the overall degenerative process. Women's drug addiction was understood as particularly dangerous because of their role in reproduction and child rearing, with addicted mothers seen as transmitting degenerative tendencies to future generations and thus accelerating the process of national decline. The cultural implications of degeneration theory extended far beyond medical and scientific circles to influence literature, art, and popular culture throughout the late 19th century. Writers and artists incorporated degenerative themes into their work, creating a rich body of cultural production that explored the relationship between individual pathology and social decay. The theory provided a framework for understanding contemporary social problems that seemed to offer both explanation and potential solutions, making it attractive to intellectuals seeking to comprehend the rapid changes transforming European society. The policy implications of degeneration theory led to various attempts at social reform and population management that anticipated some of the more troubling developments of the 20th century. Proposals for controlling reproduction among supposedly degenerate populations, restricting immigration from countries thought to harbor degenerative influences, and implementing various forms of social hygiene reflected the theory's logical implications for public policy. While most of these proposals were not implemented in 19th century France, they established intellectual precedents that would influence later developments in eugenics and social control. The international influence of French degeneration theory ensured that its impact extended far beyond France's borders to shape social and medical thinking throughout Europe and beyond. The theory's apparent scientific rigor and its ability to explain complex social phenomena in terms of simple biological mechanisms made it attractive to intellectuals and policymakers in many countries facing similar challenges of urbanization, social change, and international competition. The connection between drug addiction and national decline that had emerged from France's particular historical experience became a general framework for understanding social problems in industrial societies. The ultimate decline of degeneration theory in the early 20th century reflected both advances in scientific understanding and changing political circumstances that undermined its basic assumptions. However, its influence on attitudes toward drug addiction, social policy, and the relationship between individual behavior and collective welfare continued to shape thinking about these issues long after the theory itself had been discredited. The crisis of degeneration that emerged from France's defeat in 1870-71 had created intellectual frameworks and cultural anxieties that would influence approaches to social problems throughout the modern era. In the galleries and exhibition halls of late 19th century Paris, a striking pattern emerged that revealed as much about French social anxieties as it did about the reality of morphine addiction, despite the fact that drug dependency crossed all demographic boundaries and affected men and women of every social class. With roughly equal frequency, artists consistently chose to visualize the morphinomane as a young, often beautiful woman whose addiction represented not merely personal tragedy, but a fundamental threat to the moral and biological foundations of French society. This gendered visualization of addiction reflected deep-seated cultural fears about women's changing roles in modern urban life, their perceived vulnerability to moral corruption, and their crucial importance as the reproducers and nurturers of future generations, and character would determine France's ability to recover from its recent military humiliation and social upheaval. The artistic preference for depicting female morphinomanies emerged from a complex intersection of aesthetic. From a purely artistic standpoint, the contrast between feminine beauty and physical degradation provided painters and illustrators with dramatic visual opportunities that male subjects could not match. The spectacle of a lovely young woman destroying herself with morphine carried an emotional impact that resonated with viewers in ways that images of male addicts simply could not achieve. The traditional association of women with purity, innocence, and moral virtue made their fall into addiction seem more shocking and tragic than similar behavior by men, who were already expected to engage in various forms of vice and moral compromise as part of their participation in public life. The medical and scientific discourse surrounding women's supposed biological vulnerability to addiction provided intellectual justification for this artistic focus, while simultaneously reinforcing broader cultural assumptions about feminine weakness and moral instability. Contemporary physicians argued that women's nervous systems were more delicate and susceptible to external influences than men's, making them particularly vulnerable to the seductive appeal of consciousness-altering substances. This supposed biological fragility was compounded by what medical authorities described as women's greater emotional volatility and their tendency toward hysteria and other nervous disorders that might predispose them to seek relief through artificial means. The medical establishment's emphasis on women's neurological vulnerability created a scientific framework that seemed to explain and justify the artistic focus on female addiction. The social context of women's morphine use provided additional layers of meaning that made female addiction particularly threatening to contemporary observers. Unlike men, whose drug use could often be attributed to professional stress, war trauma, or the legitimate medical treatment of physical injuries, women's addiction was frequently seen as purely recreational or aesthetic in nature, a pursuit of pleasure and sensation that served no productive purpose and contributed nothing to society's welfare. This perception was reinforced by the association between women's morphine use and the broader culture of feminine consumption and fashion that characterized urban bourgeois life, making female addiction appear as an extreme manifestation of the frivolous pleasure-seeking that critics argued was undermining French society's moral foundations. The reproductive implications of women's drug addiction created perhaps the most profound source of anxiety for contemporary observers, who understood that addicted mothers posed direct threats to the health and character of future generations. The emerging scientific understanding of heredity suggested that maternal drug use could transmit degenerative tendencies to children, creating a biological mechanism through which individual vice could become collective catastrophe. This concern was intensified by France's declining birth rate and the growing awareness that the country's military and economic recovery would depend on producing healthy, vigorous children who could compete with the supposedly superior populations of rival nations like Germany. The visual iconography that developed around female morphinomanies drew heavily on established artistic traditions while adapting them to address contemporary social concerns. Artists frequently employed the classical motif of the fallen woman, updating traditional representations of prostitutes, adulteresses, and other morally compromised females to address the specific anxieties surrounding drug addiction. The morphinomane became a modern version of the femme fatale, whose beauty and apparent sophistication concealed moral corruption and social danger. These images often emphasized the contrast between the woman's elegant clothing and refined surroundings and the degraded nature of her behavior, suggesting that addiction could penetrate even the highest levels of society and corrupt even the most privileged individuals. The class dimensions of artistic representations of female morphinomanies reflected broader social tensions about women's increasing participation in public life and their growing economic independence. Many artistic depictions focused specifically on bourgeois or aristocratic women whose addiction represented not just personal failure, but the corruption of social classes that were supposed to provide moral leadership and cultural guidance. The image of the wealthy morphinome, surrounded by luxury while destroying herself with drugs, served as a powerful critique of the values and priorities that characterized modern urban society, suggesting that material prosperity and cultural sophistication were insufficient to protect against moral decay. The international context of these artistic representations reflected France's broader concerns about national competitiveness and cultural influence in an era of increasing international rivalry. The image of the French morphinomane became a symbol of national weakness that could be contrasted with supposedly healthier feminine ideals from other countries, particularly Germany, where women were portrayed as more devoted to traditional domestic roles and less susceptible to the corrupting influences of modern urban life. This international dimension gave artistic representations of female addiction political significance that extended far beyond their immediate aesthetic or moral impact. The commercial aspects of morphine culture provided additional reasons for focusing artistic attention on female users, whose consumption patterns and social behaviors offered rich material for social commentary and moral critique. The transformation of morphine injection into a fashionable activity complete with elaborate equipment and social rituals seemed to exemplify the broader commercialization of vice that critics argued was characteristic of modern capitalist society. Female morphonomanies, with their jeweled syringes and velvet-lined cases, embodied the intersection of consumption, fashion, and moral corruption that many observers saw as fundamentally threatening to traditional social values. The psychological dimensions of artistic representations of female morphonomanies reflected contemporary understanding of women's mental and emotional characteristics, which were thought to make them particularly susceptible to the appeal of artificial paradises. The supposed feminine tendency toward fantasy, emotion, and aesthetic appreciation was seen as creating natural affinities for experiences that promised to enhance beauty, intensify feeling, and provide escape from the mundane realities of daily life. This psychological profile made women seem like ideal subjects for exploring the broader themes of modern alienation and the search for transcendence that characterized much late 19th century art and literature. The moral framework that surrounded artistic representations of female morphonomanies drew on established religious and philosophical traditions while adapting them to address contemporary social concerns. The image of the addicted woman served as a modern version of traditional warnings about the dangers of sensual indulgence and the importance of moral discipline, updated to address the specific challenges posed by industrial society and modern urban life. These representations often carried implicit messages about the need for stronger social controls and moral education that could protect vulnerable individuals from the temptations of modern life. The lasting influence of these gendered representations of addiction extended far beyond their immediate historical context to shape attitudes toward women, drugs, and social problems that persist in various forms to the present day. The association between feminine weakness and drug addiction, the emphasis on women's role as reproducers and nurturers of future generations, and the connection between individual vice and collective decline all became enduring themes in discussions of addiction and social policy that continue to influence contemporary debates about these issues. Paul Albert Besnard's 1887 etching Morphonomènes ou Le Plumet stands as one of the most sophisticated and psychologically penetrating artistic commentaries on the morphine epidemic that had consumed fin de siècle Parisian society. Unlike the crude moralizing that characterized much contemporary art dealing with drug addiction, Besnard's work operated through a complex system of visual metaphors and symbolic substitutions that revealed the artist's deep understanding of both the social dynamics of elite addiction and the aesthetic principles that governed fashionable society. The etching's genius lay not in its explicit condemnation of morphine use, but in its subtle demonstration of how drug addiction had become seamlessly integrated into the broader culture of consumption, fashion, and aesthetic pleasure that defined upper-class Parisian life. The setting Besnard chose for his composition, a fashionable café frequented by elegant Parisiennes, was itself a pointed commentary on the social normalization of drug use among the city's elite. Rather than depicting his morphinomanies in the sordid surroundings typically associated with addiction, Besnard placed them in the very heart of respectable society, surrounded by the markers of wealth, taste, and cultural sophistication that were supposed to protect against moral corruption. The café setting suggested that morphine addiction had penetrated so deeply into Parisian social life that it could flourish openly in spaces dedicated to refined pleasure and intellectual discourse, making it impossible to distinguish between legitimate social activity and destructive vice. The artist's decision to focus on fashionable women rather than the male addicts, who were equally numerous in Parisian society, reflected both aesthetic considerations and deeper cultural anxieties about feminine consumption and its relationship to social stability. Besnard understood that female figures would provide more visually compelling subjects, while simultaneously embodying broader concerns about women's role as both consumers and reproducers in modern urban society. The elegant Parisians in his etching represented not just individual addicts, but an entire class of women whose pursuit of aesthetic pleasure and fashionable sensation had led them into forms of consumption that threatened both personal and social welfare. The swirling cloud of smoke that dominates the composition served multiple symbolic functions that revealed Besnard's sophisticated understanding of the relationship between different forms of intoxication and social behavior. On one level, the smoke could be interpreted as ordinary tobacco smoke from cigarettes or pipes, making the image appear to depict nothing more scandalous than fashionable women enjoying a social gathering. However, the smoke's unusual density and the way it seemed to envelop the figures suggested something more sinister, perhaps the vapors from heated opium, or the metaphorical cloud of confusion and moral obscurity that surrounded drug use in polite society. This ambiguity allowed viewers to see either innocent social activity or evidence of hidden vice, depending on their own knowledge and moral perspective. The feather that Besnard substituted for the hypodermic needle represented perhaps the most brilliant symbolic innovation in the entire composition, demonstrating the artist's ability to transform a crude medical instrument into an object of aesthetic contemplation, while simultaneously preserving its essential meaning. The feather rewritten, l'œil plumé of the etching's title, served as both a fashionable accessory that might naturally appear in a scene of feminine elegance and a visual metaphor for the needle that would have made the image's meaning unmistakably explicit. This substitution allowed Besnard to address his subject matter directly while maintaining the aesthetic refinement that was essential to his artistic vision and social commentary. The choice of a feather as the needle's substitute carried additional layers of meaning that connected drug addiction to broader themes of fashion, consumption, and social display. Feathers were among the most prized accessories in late 19th century women's fashion, representing both luxury and the pursuit of aesthetic effect that characterized fashionable society. By using a feather to represent the hypodermic needle, Besnard suggested that morphine injection had become simply another form of fashionable accessory, distinguished from other luxury goods only by its hidden nature and destructive effects. The feather's lightness and delicacy also contrasted ironically with the serious medical and social consequences of the behavior it represented. The concept of sartorial indulgence that contemporary critics identified in Besnard's work reflected the artist's understanding of how drug addiction had become integrated into the broader culture of fashion and consumption that defined elite Parisian society. The women in the etching were depicted not as degraded addicts but as fashion plates, whose drug use represented simply another form of the aesthetic consumption that characterized their entire lifestyle. Their elegant clothing, sophisticated accessories, and refined surroundings suggested that morphine addiction had become a luxury, good like any other, distinguished from legitimate pleasures only by social taboos, rather than any obvious difference in its appeal or effects. The connection between drug use and the ephemeral pleasure of fashion that Besnard explored in his etching revealed his sophisticated understanding of the psychological and social dynamics that drove both phenomena. Fashion and drug addiction shared certain essential characteristics. Both provided temporary pleasure and social distinction. Both required continuous consumption to maintain their effects, and both created dependencies that were as much psychological as physical. The pursuit of fashionable sensation and the pursuit of chemical sensation were revealed as fundamentally similar activities that differed only in their social acceptability and legal status. The temporal dimensions of Besnard's critique were embedded in his emphasis on ephemerality and the constant pursuit of novelty that characterized both fashion and drug culture. The women in his etching appeared to be engaged in an endless cycle of consumption and sensation-seeking that provided no lasting satisfaction or genuine fulfillment. Their elegant appearance masked an underlying emptiness that could only be temporarily filled through the continuous pursuit of new pleasures and sensations, whether chemical or aesthetic. This critique of modern consumer culture anticipated many of the concerns that would become central to 20th century social criticism. The artistic technique that Besnard employed in creating the etching reinforced the work's thematic content through its emphasis on surface effects and decorative elaboration. The intricate details of clothing, accessories, and interior decoration that filled the composition created a visual equivalent to the sensory overload that characterized both fashionable society and drug-induced experience. The etching's technical sophistication demonstrated the artist's mastery of his medium while simultaneously suggesting that such technical virtuosity, like the fashionable consumption it depicted, essential truths about human experience. The social reception of Besnard's etching reflected the complex attitudes toward both art and addiction that characterized late 19th century Parisian culture. Critics praised the work's aesthetic sophistication and psychological insight while debating its moral implications and social message. Some viewers saw it as a condemnation of fashionable vice, while others interpreted it as a celebration of aesthetic refinement that transcended conventional moral categories. This ambiguity was central to the work's power and influence, allowing it to function simultaneously as social criticism and aesthetic object. The international influence of Besnard's approach to depicting addiction established artistic precedents that would influence representations of drug use and consumer culture throughout the modern period. His technique of using visual metaphors and symbolic substitutions to address controversial subjects while maintaining aesthetic refinement became a model for artists seeking to engage with social issues without sacrificing artistic integrity. The connection he established between addiction and consumption culture would prove particularly prophetic, anticipating many of the concerns that would dominate discussions of these issues in the 20th and 21st centuries.